Hi and welcome to the Archive of History. Tonight we journey to a city that no longer exists, swept away by fire and conquest so completely that for centuries it lived only in the hostile words of its enemies. A place of immense wealth and power, of purple-dyed sails and bronze-beaked warships, cutting through Mediterranean waters, of merchant princes, who commanded the western seas with fleets that stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the shores of the Levant. This is the story of Carthage, the Phoenician empire that stood against Rome and nearly won, that brought the eternal city to its knees, that taught the Romans the meaning of fear. For more than 7 centuries, this North African power controlled the trade routes that bound the ancient world together. Its fleets sailed to the tin mines of distant Britain, threading through the fog-shrouded waters beyond the known world. They ventured down the African coast into waters no Greek had ever charted, past the great burning mountain and into seas where the sun beat down with unbearable intensity. They crossed to the distant shores of the Atlantic, to islands lost in legend. Its generals commanded armies of a dozen nationalities, speaking a babel of tongues but united in the pursuit of victory. Its most famous son crossed the Alps with war elephants, an achievement deemed impossible, and brought fire and death to the Italian peninsula for 16 long years. And yet when Rome finally destroyed Carthage in an act of deliberate, systematic annihilation, the victors erased almost everything. They burned the libraries with their scrolls of navigation and agricultural wisdom. They demolished the temples until not one stone stood upon another. They tore down the great circular harbors that had been the wonder of the ancient world. They sold the survivors into slavery and left us only fragments, potsherds, and the testimony of their enemies. Tonight we will resurrect that lost world from the ashes and silence of millennia. We will walk the narrow streets of ancient Carthage in its golden age, when the city was at the height of its power and wealth. We will feel the salt spray of its legendary circular harbors, those engineering marvels that could house more than 200 warships under cover, hidden from the eyes of rivals. We will hear the polyglot tumult of its markets, where merchants haggled in Punic and Greek, in Berber and Iberian and the harsh syllables of Gaul. We will sail with its merchants on their perilous voyages, riding the seasonal winds from port to port, our holds heavy with amphorae of wine and oil, our purses jingling with silver from Iberian mines. We will stand with its soldiers, mercenaries from 3 continents, as they face the disciplined legions of Rome. We will witness the slow, terrible destruction of a civilization that defied the greatest empire the world had ever known, that chose annihilation over surrender, that burned rather than submit. We will explore the purple dye extracted from mountains of tiny shells, the color that made fortunes and marked kings. We will descend into the circular harbors, those perfectly engineered basins where ships could be launched within hours, an industrial marvel centuries ahead of its time. We will learn of the agricultural innovations that transformed North Africa into the breadbasket of the ancient Mediterranean, feeding cities across 3 continents. We will follow young Hannibal as he swears his famous oath, pledging eternal enmity to Rome. We will march with him over the Alps, sharing the terror and exhilaration of that impossible crossing. We will stand on the field of Cannae, the greatest tactical victory in ancient warfare, where 50,000 Romans died in a single afternoon. And we will witness the final days of Carthage, the 3-year siege, the street-by-street fighting, the flames that consumed 7 centuries of civilization. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. Your voices from around the world remind me that history connects us all, that these ancient stories still resonate across the centuries. Now, let the noise of the modern world fade away, turn off the lamp, settle into comfort. Close your eyes if you wish, take a slow breath, and feel yourself drifting backward through time, through centuries and millennia, past the fall of Rome, past the birth of Christ, past the conquests of Alexander, back to a world of bronze and iron, of galleys and caravans, of gods whose names are now forgotten. Let us travel back across 23 centuries to a city of white walls rising from the North African shore, to the empire of Carthage, and to the people who called it home. Let us begin at the beginning, in the ancient cities of the Phoenician coast, in the shadow of the cedars of Lebanon, where our story truly starts. The Purple Shore, Phoenicia, and the birth of a maritime people. The story begins not in North Africa, but far to the east, on the narrow coastal plain of the Levant, where the mountains of Lebanon rise directly from the Mediterranean Sea. here squeezed between the peaks and the water, a remarkable people built a chain of city-states that would change the course of history. The Greeks called them Phoenicians, from Phoenix, their word for purple, but they called themselves Canaanites, people of the coast. Their cities bore names that echo through antiquity: Tyre and Sidon, Byblos and Berytus, each an independent kingdom, each a maritime power in miniature. Among these cities, Tyre stood preeminent, built on a pair of small rocky islands connected by a narrow causeway, surrounded by the deep blue waters of the eastern Mediterranean. The position was nearly impregnable. Enemies approaching by land found their way blocked by water and walls. Enemies approaching by sea faced fortifications rising directly from the waves, and a fleet of warships that could be launched at a moment's notice. The city had two harbors, one facing north toward Sidon, one facing south toward the Egyptian coast. Between these harbors, the city rose in tiers, houses of whitewashed stone climbing the rocky slopes, crowned by temples and palaces whose walls were paneled with the legendary cedar wood of Lebanon, brought down from the mountains on the backs of men and mules. The Tyrians, like all Phoenicians, were master sailors and traders. They had to be. The coastal strip offered little agricultural land, hemmed in by the mountains. The sea was both their highway and their livelihood. From earliest antiquity, Phoenician ships had plied the eastern Mediterranean, carrying goods between the great empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia, between the Hittites of Anatolia and the Mycenaeans of Greece. They were the middlemen of the Bronze Age world, the merchants who connected civilization to civilization, who spoke a dozen languages and knew the prevailing winds of every season, who could read the stars and navigate by dead reckoning across open water when the stars were hidden by clouds. But the Phoenicians were more than mere carriers. They were producers of the most valuable commodity in the ancient world, a dye so rare and expensive that it became the mark of royalty, the symbol of divine authority. This was Tyrian purple, and its creation was a closely guarded secret that made the city fabulously wealthy. The dye was extracted from the murex, a species of sea snail found in the shallow waters of the Mediterranean. Each snail contained only a tiny droplet of the precious fluid hidden in a gland near its breathing tube. To produce enough dye to color a single toga required thousands of snails. The harvest was back-breaking work. Divers descended to the seafloor with weighted nets, gathering the snails by hand. The snails were brought to shore and placed in great stone vats where they were left to decompose in the sun. The stench was overpowering, a nauseating miasma of rotting flesh that hung over the dye works like a visible cloud. Ancient writers described it as one of the most terrible smells in the world, so strong that dye workers could be identified by their odor alone, so pervasive that the dye-working districts of Phoenician cities were located on the outskirts, downwind of the respectable quarters. After days of putrefaction, the liquefied mass was strained and the precious fluid extracted. The actual dye was colorless at first, or a pale yellowish green. Only when exposed to air and sunlight did it begin to transform, passing through shades of yellow and green before finally settling into that deep luminous purple that gave the Phoenicians their Greek name. The exact shade varied with the concentration and the mixture. Lighter purples, achieved by diluting the dye or mixing it with other colors, were less valuable. But the deep, saturated purple that could only be achieved with pure murex dye, applied multiple times, was worth literally more than its weight in gold. A single pound of purple-dyed wool could cost 1,000 denarii, more than a skilled craftsman earned in 3 years. Only the wealthiest individuals could afford garments dyed entirely in Tyrian purple. Kings and emperors draped themselves in it. Roman senators wore togas with purple stripes. The color became synonymous with power, wealth, and authority. And Tyre controlled the production. The secrets passed from father to son in the dye-working families, guarded as jealously as any military secret. The wealth generated by the purple trade was immense, but it was only one stream in the river of Phoenician commerce. The cedars of Lebanon, those magnificent trees whose trunks could reach 6 feet in diameter, were prized across the ancient world. Egypt had no timber suitable for building, and had imported cedar since the time of the pyramids. The great empires of Mesopotamia, surrounded by desert and marsh, paid premium prices for Lebanese wood. Phoenician merchants also traded in wine and olive oil, in finely woven textiles, in worked metal and glass. They were among the first to develop the technique of glass blowing, producing delicate vessels that were lighter and more beautiful than anything the world had seen. Their metal workers were renowned, crafting everything from jewelry to weapons. A Phoenician ship arriving in port carried goods from a dozen different lands, acquired through an intricate web of trade routes that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates, from Cyprus to Crete. But wealth attracts envy, and power attracts aggression. The narrow coastal cities of Phoenicia were vulnerable to the great land empires that periodically arose in the interior. In the 9th century before the Common Era, the Assyrian Empire was expanding westward, conquering city after city, incorporating them into a vast system of tribute and forced labor. The Assyrian army was the most fearsome military machine of the age, a well-organized force of infantry, cavalry, and siege engineers who could reduce even the strongest fortress given enough time. The Phoenician cities, despite their wealth and their walls, could not stand against this juggernaut. One by one, they submitted, agreeing to pay tribute in exchange for a semblance of autonomy. But tribute was a burden, and submission was a humiliation. The Phoenician kings chafed under Assyrian domination, and they began to look westward, to the vast open waters of the Mediterranean, to the lands beyond the reach of Assyrian armies. For generations, Phoenician merchants had been establishing trading posts across the Mediterranean, small settlements that served as safe harbors, as places to rest and resupply, as trading stations where they could barter with the indigenous peoples. A ship sailing west from Tyre might stop at Cyprus to take on water and trade for copper. It might continue to Crete, to the Aegean Islands, perhaps as far as mainland Greece, or it might turn south, hugging the North African coast, stopping at trading posts in Libya and beyond. Or it might sail northwest, to Sicily, to Sardinia, to the distant coasts of Iberia, where silver could be found in quantities undreamed of in the east. Some of these trading posts grew into permanent settlements. Colonists, younger sons with no inheritance, dispossessed craftsmen, traders tired of the long voyage home, all found reasons to stay. They married local women, built houses, planted crops. These colonies maintained ties with their mother cities, but they were increasingly independent, small city-states in their own right. The greatest of all these colonies, the one destined to eclipse even Tyre itself, would be founded on a peninsula jutting into the azure waters of the Gulf of Tunis. The traditional founding date, preserved in classical sources, is 814 BCE, though modern archaeology suggests the settlement may have begun slightly later, perhaps in the last decades of the 9th century. The story of its founding, passed down through generations and eventually recorded by Greek and Roman historians centuries after the fact, is one of exile, ambition, murder, and cunning. It tells of a Tyrian princess, whose name in Phoenician was Alyssa, though the Romans would call her Dido. She was the daughter of a king of Tyre, and she had married her uncle, a priest of the god Melkart, a man of great wealth and influence. But her brother Pygmalion, who had inherited the throne, was jealous of this wealth. In a fit of greed, he had his uncle murdered and seized his fortune. Alyssa, fearing for her own life, realized she had to flee. She was intelligent, resourceful, and determined. She gathered supporters, members of her murdered husband's faction, nobles who opposed Pygmalion's rule, and she began to plan her escape. In secret, she loaded several ships with as much treasure as she could carry without arousing suspicion. Gold and silver, jewels, fine cloth, religious artifacts, the portable wealth of a great household. Then, under the pretext of a religious pilgrimage, she and her followers set sail from Tyre, heading west. Pygmalion, when he realized what had happened, raged and swore vengeance, but his sister was already beyond his reach, somewhere on the vast expanse of the Mediterranean, sailing toward an uncertain future. Alyssa and her followers made their way westward, stopping at various Phoenician colonies, gathering more ships, more followers. Some sources claim they stopped at Cyprus and brought away 80 young women destined for temple service, to provide wives for the men of the expedition. Finally, they reached the coast of North Africa, near the site of modern Tunis. The location was perfect for a new settlement. The coast offered natural harbors, fresh water was available from nearby springs. The soil of the surrounding plains was rich and fertile, capable of supporting agriculture. And crucially, the site commanded the narrowest point of the Mediterranean, the strait between Sicily and Africa, where ships traveling between the eastern and western basins of that great sea would pass close to shore. Any city built here could control and tax that maritime traffic. Alyssa saw all of this with the practiced eye of a merchant princess. She negotiated with the local Berber king, Irabas, for land. The story, as it comes down to us, has the quality of legend. Iabas, amused or contemptuous, offered Alyssa only as much land as could be enclosed by an ox hide. She accepted without complaint. Then she took the hide, cut it into the thinnest possible strips, and used these strips to mark out a vast semicircular territory, with the sea forming the other boundary. The land enclosed was enough for a small city. Iabas, bound by his word, and perhaps impressed by her cleverness, agreed to the deal. And there, on a hill overlooking the bay, Alyssa founded her city. The hill was called Bursa in Phoenician, meaning hide, and it would become the citadel, the sacred and political heart of the new city. The Phoenicians called their new home Carthage, simply new city. The Greeks would transliterate this as Carchedon. To the Romans, it would be Carthago. To us it is Carthage, and from this foundation of exile and ambition would rise an empire that would challenge Rome itself for mastery of the Western world. The early decades of Carthage were undoubtedly difficult. The colonists had to clear land, build houses, construct fortifications. They had to establish relations with the indigenous Berber peoples who inhabited the interior of North Africa, peoples who spoke a language unrelated to Phoenician, and who viewed these newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. They had to plant crops in unfamiliar soil, under an African sun hotter and fiercer than the climate of the Levantine coast. They had to defend themselves against raiders and wild animals, but they persevered. The settlers brought with them all the skills of Phoenician civilization: shipbuilding and navigation, metalworking and weaving, literacy and record-keeping, the worship of their gods. They built a temple to Bel-ul-Hammon on the highest point of the Bursa. They established a second sacred precinct outside the city walls, a place that would become known as the Tophet, where offerings would be made to ensure the city's prosperity. They dug wells and constructed cisterns to store rainwater. They laid out streets and workshops and residential quarters. Slowly the settlement grew. And grow it did. New settlers arrived from Phoenicia, from Tyre and Sidon, and the other coastal cities, drawn by opportunity or fleeing troubles at home. The population swelled. More land was brought under cultivation. The harbor, initially just a natural inlet, was improved and expanded. Warehouses were built to store goods. Workshops produced pottery, textiles, metalwork. Carthaginian merchants began to trade with the Berber tribes, exchanging manufactured goods for agricultural products, livestock, and raw materials. They sent ships east to maintain contact with Tyre and the other Phoenician cities. They sent ships west, exploring the coast, establishing their own trading posts and colonies along the shores of North Africa, on the islands of the western Mediterranean, and on the distant coast of Iberia. Within a few generations, Carthage was no longer just another small colony clinging to a hostile shore. It was becoming a power in its own right, a city with its own identity, its own ambitions, its own destiny. The new city was finding its place in the world, and that place would be at the center of a maritime empire that stretched across the western Mediterranean. The rise of the Punic Empire, colonies, trade, and the conquest of the sea. By the 7th century BCE, the political landscape of the eastern Mediterranean had shifted dramatically, and with it, the fortunes of the Phoenician homeland. The Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Levant, collapsed under the weight of its own brutality and overextension, destroyed by a coalition of Medes and Babylonians. The Phoenician cities briefly enjoyed a measure of independence, but it was short-lived. The Babylonians, under Nebuchadnezzar, soon imposed their own rule. They besieged Tyre for 13 years, from 586 to 573 BCE, battering the island city with siege engines and starvation, finally forcing a negotiated submission. Then the Persians came, sweeping across the Near East in the 6th century, incorporating the Phoenician cities into their vast empire. The cities of the Levantine coast maintained their identities and a degree of local autonomy, but they were no longer truly free. They paid tribute to Persian kings. They provided ships for Persian fleets. They were provinces, however prosperous, of a foreign empire centered far to the east in Persepolis and Susa. But Carthage, across the sea and beyond the reach of land-based empires, remained independent. No Persian army could march across the Mediterranean. No Babylonian tribute collector could cross the water to demand payment. Carthage acknowledged its cultural and commercial ties to Tyre, to Sidon, to the other Phoenician cities. Carthaginian traders spoke a Phoenician dialect. They worshipped Phoenician gods. They maintained trade networks that connected them to the eastern Mediterranean. But politically, they owed allegiance to no one. The city was free to pursue its own interests, to expand its own power, to build its own empire, and expand it did, methodically, pragmatically, driven by the same commercial instincts that had founded the city in the first place. Carthaginian expansion was not primarily about conquest for glory or territorial aggrandizement. It was about control of trade routes, access to resources, and the creation of a secure commercial network. The Carthaginians were merchants first, soldiers second. War was a tool, sometimes necessary, but always expensive. Better to establish a mutually profitable trading relationship. Better to negotiate a treaty that gave Carthage favorable terms. But when negotiation failed, when rivals threatened Carthaginian interests, the city was willing and able to use force. By the 6th century BCE, Carthage had become the dominant power in the Western Phoenician world, the de facto leader of a loose confederation of Phoenician colonies scattered across the Mediterranean. Other Phoenician settlements, in North Africa, in Sicily, in Sardinia, in Iberia, looked to Carthage for leadership, for military protection, for commercial partnership. Carthage did not rule these cities directly. It did not appoint governors or demand tribute, at least not initially. The relationship was more subtle, based on shared culture, common commercial interests, and the understanding that Carthage, with its large population, its powerful fleet, and its growing wealth, was the strongest Phoenician city, and therefore the natural leader. This network of cities and trading posts became known to historians as the Punic world, from the Latin Punici, the Roman word for the Phoenicians of the West. The term distinguished them from the Phoenicians of the Levant who remained under Persian rule. The Punics, while maintaining their Phoenician identity, were developing their own distinct culture, shaped by centuries in the West, by interaction with Berber, Iberian, and Greek peoples, by the particular geography and challenges of the Western Mediterranean. They were no longer simply transplanted Easterners, they were something new, a hybrid civilization, thoroughly Phoenician in language and religion but uniquely Western in outlook and experience. The foundation of Carthaginian power was its fleet. The city's navy was the largest and most advanced in the Western Mediterranean, a force that could be expanded rapidly in times of war, that dominated the sea lanes, and that protected Carthaginian merchant shipping while threatening that of rivals. Carthaginian warships were galleys, long and narrow vessels propelled primarily by oars, though they carried a single mast and sail for traveling in favorable winds. The primary warship was the trireme, a galley with 3 banks of oars on each side, manned by 170 rowers plus sailors and marines. The trireme was fast and maneuverable, capable of sustained speeds that no sailing vessel could match in calm conditions. Its primary weapon was a bronze ram mounted at the waterline of the bow. In battle, a trireme would attempt to ram an enemy ship, punching a hole in its hull and causing it to take on water and sink. Or it would shear off the oars on one side of an enemy vessel, crippling it. Marines armed with bows, javelins and swords would attempt to board damaged enemy ships, fighting hand-to-hand on the cramped, blood-slicked decks. But Carthaginian naval power was not just about warships. It was about infrastructure, about the ability to build, maintain and repair a large fleet, and that infrastructure was concentrated in one extraordinary facility, the harbors of Carthage. These were not natural harbors, not simple inlets or bays where ships could shelter. They were entirely artificial, excavated from the land, a triumph of ancient engineering that had no parallel in the Mediterranean world. Construction likely began in the 4th century BCE and continued for generations, each phase expanding and improving the design. The final form, which existed in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, consisted of 2 interconnected circular basins, one for merchant shipping, one for the navy, plus an outer rectangular harbor for commercial vessels. The military harbor, the Kothon, was the centerpiece. It was a perfect circle, perhaps 300 meters in diameter, with a small artificial island at its center. This island housed the Admiralty Building, a complex of offices where naval commanders planned campaigns, where navigators studied charts, where shipwrights designed new vessels. Radiating from the island were the ship sheds, long covered slips where warships were stored when not at sea. Each shed could house a single galley pulled up onto wooden rollers to keep the hull out of the water, thus preventing the wood from becoming waterlogged and the hull from being damaged by marine organisms. There were over 200 of these sheds, arranged in 2 concentric rings, creating a sight that awed ancient visitors. When all the sheds were occupied, the Carthaginian fleet could muster more than 200 warships, a force larger than any other city-state in the West could match. The entrance to the military harbor was narrow and could be closed with a chain. Once inside, the harbor was invisible from the sea, concealed by high walls. An enemy could not observe how many ships Carthage possessed or learn about new naval technologies. The secrecy was intentional, part of Carthage's strategy of maintaining a technological and tactical edge over rivals. The merchant harbor, though less spectacular, was equally important. It could accommodate dozens of cargo vessels at once, with quays and warehouses for loading and unloading goods. The entire harbor complex was a statement of Carthaginian power and wealth, a declaration that this city, built on a North African peninsula far from the traditional centers of Mediterranean civilization, had mastered the sea. No city in the Greek world could match it. Certainly no city in Italy could. When foreign ambassadors visited Carthage, they were invariably taken to see the harbors, and they returned home with tales of marvels that seemed almost beyond belief. The harbors were Carthage's beating heart, the place where its power was physically manifest, where the wealth of trade and the might of the navy came together in stone and water. Beyond the city itself, Carthage built an empire through a combination of conquest, colonization, and treaty. The model was fundamentally different from later Roman imperialism. Carthage did not seek to incorporate conquered territories into a unified state. It did not impose its language, its laws, or its culture on subject peoples. Instead, it established a network of controlled territories, client states, and allied cities, each with a different relationship to Carthage, but all contributing to Carthaginian power and prosperity. The most direct control was exercised over the immediate hinterland of Carthage, the territory called the Chora. This was the agricultural heartland, a belt of rich farmland that stretched inland from the coast. Carthaginian citizens and wealthy landowners operated large estates here, producing grain, olives, grapes, and fruit for export. The farms were worked by slaves, by tenant farmers, and by indigenous Berbers who had been incorporated into the Carthaginian economy. This agricultural base was crucial. It fed the city's growing population and produced surpluses for trade. Carthaginian agricultural techniques were advanced for the ancient world. Large manuals were written on the subject, detailing methods of irrigation, crop rotation, and animal husbandry. These techniques transformed North Africa into one of the most productive agricultural regions in the Mediterranean, a status it would retain through Roman and later Arab rule. Beyond the Chora, Carthage controlled or influenced a vast territory along the North African coast, from modern Libya in the east to the Atlantic coast of Morocco in the west. This control took various forms. Some cities were Carthaginian foundations, colonies established by settlers from Carthage or other Punic cities. Others were indigenous Berber towns that had entered into treaties with Carthage, agreeing to pay tribute or provide soldiers in exchange for protection and access to Carthaginian markets. Still others were trading posts, small fortified settlements that served as points of contact between Carthaginian merchants and local populations. The Berber peoples of North Africa were diverse, speaking various related languages, organized into tribes and small kingdoms. Some were nomadic pastoralists, herding sheep and cattle across the semi-arid interior. Others were settled farmers, cultivating the fertile valleys. Carthage's relationship with these peoples was complex and varied. Some Berber tribes were loyal allies, their cavalry forming the backbone of Carthaginian armies. Other tribes were hostile, raiding Carthaginian territories, ambushing caravans, requiring constant military vigilance. Carthage managed these relationships through a combination of diplomacy, marriage alliances, bribery, and when necessary, military expeditions to punish raiders or reassert control over rebellious regions. Across the sea, Carthage controlled extensive territories in the western Mediterranean islands. In Sicily, the western third of the island, including the important cities of Lilybaeum, Motia, and Panormus, was under Carthaginian control by the 5th century BCE. These were critical possessions, strategically located and economically valuable. They produced grain and wine, and they served as military bases for operations against the Greek cities that controlled the rest of the island. In Sardinia, Carthage dominated much of the coast, though the mountainous interior remained largely under the control of indigenous Nuragic peoples who fiercely resisted foreign domination. In the Balearic Islands, Ibiza became a major Carthaginian colony, exporting salt, wine, and the services of the famous Balearic slingers, who served as mercenaries in Carthaginian armies across the Mediterranean. And in Iberia, the southern and eastern coasts were dotted with Carthaginian trading posts and colonies. Cities like Gadea, modern Cadiz, were ancient Phoenician foundations that had become part of the Carthaginian network. The real prize in Iberia, however, was the interior, where vast deposits of silver ore awaited exploitation. This region would become the focus of intense Carthaginian interest in the 3rd century BCE, with consequences that would change the course of history. This far-flung empire was not governed from Carthage in any direct sense. The city did not send out administrators or impose a uniform system of laws. Instead, each possession maintained a degree of local autonomy. Indigenous elites were co-opted, allowed to retain their positions and privileges in exchange for loyalty and tribute. Local traditions were respected. Local gods worshipped alongside Carthaginian deities. What Carthage demanded was loyalty, access, and resources. Loyal cities provided soldiers for Carthaginian armies, crews for Carthaginian fleets. They allowed Carthaginian merchants to operate freely, to trade on favorable terms, to dominate local economies. They paid tribute, either in money or in kind, shipments of grain, metals, or other goods. In return, they received Carthaginian protection, access to Carthaginian markets, and a share in the prosperity that trade brought. It was an empire built on commerce rather than conquest, on profit rather than glory, and for centuries it was extraordinarily successful, making Carthage the wealthiest city in the western Mediterranean, a metropolis whose splendor rivaled Alexandria and Antioch, whose merchants sailed every sea, whose name was known and feared from the Pillars of Hercules to the coast of Syria. The Purple City, daily life in Carthage at its height. Now let us step into the city itself, into Carthage at the height of its power, in the 4th or 3rd century BCE, when the city was home to perhaps 300,000 people, when its markets overflowed with goods from 3 continents, when its harbors sheltered fleets that ruled the western seas. Imagine yourself standing at dawn on one of the stone quays of the rectangular merchant harbor. The air is cool, touched with the salt scent of the sea and the less pleasant odors of fish, tar, and humanity. The sun is just rising over the low hills to the east, casting long shadows across the water. Before you, the harbor is already alive with activity. Dozens of merchant vessels are tied up at the quays or anchored in the deeper water, their masts creating a forest of wood against the pale morning sky. These merchantmen are broad-beamed, deep-hulled ships, built to carry maximum cargo with minimum crew. They are painted in earth tones, reds and browns and yellows, to protect the wood against sun and salt. Their sails, currently furled, are made of linen, often treated with tannin to resist rot, giving them a rusty red-brown color. Some bear symbols painted on the canvas, an eye to ward off evil, a palm tree to invoke divine protection, a fish or a dolphin. The ships are being loaded and unloaded by gangs of laborers, men stripped to loincloths in the heat, their brown skin glistening with sweat. They carry heavy amphorae on their shoulders, each amphora sealed with a clay stopper and marked with a stamp indicating its contents and origin. The amphorae contain olive oil from the Carthaginian hinterland, wine from Sicily, garum from Iberia. Garum was a fermented fish sauce, made by layering fish and salt in vast clay vessels and leaving them to ferment in the sun for months. The resulting liquid, strained and bottled, was pungent and salty, and it was a staple condiment across the ancient world, as ubiquitous then as ketchup is today. Other goods are being loaded: bundles of hides, stacks of metal ingots, baskets of dates and figs, bales of cloth. The air is filled with the shouts of foremen, the creaking of ropes, the splash of cargo being swung over the side, the rhythmic chanting of laborers working in unison to move a particularly heavy load. You thread your way through the bustle of the docks, stepping over coils of rope, skirting puddles of seawater and less identifiable liquids. Merchants stand in small groups, negotiating deals, their voices rising in argument over prices and quality. You hear Punic, of course, the primary language of Carthage, a Semitic tongue closely related to Phoenician and to Hebrew. It sounds harsh to Greek ears, full of guttural consonants and emphatic sounds. But you also hear Greek, spoken by traders from Syracuse, from Massalia, from Athens. You hear the various Berber languages of the North African interior, musical and rhythmic. You hear Iberian, a language unrelated to any other, the speech of the distant Western Peninsula. There are even a few Gauls, tall men with long hair and thick mustaches, come to trade furs and amber. Carthage is a cosmopolitan place, a city where the products and peoples of 3 continents meet and mingle, where fortunes can be made or lost on a single voyage, where a clever trader can rise from poverty to wealth in a generation. From the docks you make your way into the commercial heart of the city. The streets here are narrow and winding, offering shade from the hot North African sun. The houses press close on either side, most 2 or 3 stories tall, constructed of stone or mud brick plastered and whitewashed. The better houses have small windows on the upper floors, screened with wooden lattices for privacy and shade. The ground floors are often shops or workshops, their fronts open to the street, displaying goods for sale. You pass a pottery shop, its shelves lined with bowls, plates and amphorae. The potter works at a wheel in the back, his hands shaping wet clay with practiced ease. You pass a metal worker's shop, the air shimmering with heat from a charcoal forge, the clang of hammer on anvil rhythmic and loud. The smith is working on a bronze fitting for a ship, beating the glowing metal into shape. You pass a textile merchant's shop, bolts of cloth displayed in the doorway, rough undyed wool for everyday wear, finer woven cloth in various colors, and most expensive of all, a few precious lengths of purple-dyed fabric, kept behind a locked door, the color so deep and saturated that it seems almost to glow. The streets are paved in the wealthier districts, the stones worn smooth by centuries of feet and cartwheels. In the poorer areas, the streets are packed earth, dusty in the dry season, muddy when it rains. Open sewers run down the sides of the streets, carrying waste down toward the sea. The smell is noticeable but not overwhelming, especially when the sea breeze is blowing. Water is brought to the city by aqueducts from springs in the hills, feeding public fountains where women gather with clay jars to draw water for their households. The fountains are social centers, places where news and gossip are exchanged, where marriages are arranged and reputations made or destroyed. As you continue walking, you pass through a residential quarter. The houses here are larger, built around interior courtyards that provide privacy and a measure of coolness. Through an open door you catch a glimpse of such a courtyard. A small garden with potted plants, a fountain in the center, the floor paved with small colored stones, arranged in a geometric pattern. These are the homes of Carthage's merchant elite, families whose fortunes are built on trade, on landholdings, on shares in silver mines and purple dye works. They live lives of considerable luxury, their homes filled with imported goods, Greek pottery, Egyptian furniture, Iberian metalwork. They recline on couches inlaid with ivory and ebony. They dine on roasted meat and honey cakes, fruits imported from distant lands, wine diluted with water, as is proper. They own dozens of slaves who cook their meals, clean their homes, tend their gardens, and accompany them through the streets. Slavery is a fact of life in Carthage, as it is in every ancient society. Slaves are property, bought and sold in markets, used for labor and service. They come from many sources: prisoners of war, people captured by pirates or kidnappers and sold, children born to slave parents, people who have sold themselves or their children into slavery to pay debts. Treatment varies widely. Some slaves, especially those who work in wealthy households or who possess valuable skills, live relatively comfortable lives and may earn their freedom. Others, those who labor in the mines or row in the galleys, endure short, brutal existences, their bodies broken by overwork and abuse. At the heart of the city, dominating the skyline, is the Bursa, the citadel hill where Carthage was first founded. The slopes of the Bursa are crowned with temples, the most important religious sites in the city. The great temple of Eshmon, god of healing and of spring, rises on the summit. It is a magnificent structure, a rectangle of dressed limestone blocks, its entrance flanked by columns carved with lotus flowers and papyrus, motifs borrowed from Egyptian architecture. Inside, the temple is divided into multiple chambers, dim and cool, the air heavy with incense. At the innermost sanctuary, accessible only to priests, stands the statue of the god, a figure of gold and ivory, its eyes inlaid with precious stones. Worshippers come to the temple with offerings, animals for sacrifice, jars of oil and wine, precious objects of metal or cloth. They come to pray for healing, for success in business, for safe return from voyages. The priests, dressed in elaborate robes, perform the sacrifices on a great altar outside the temple, cutting the throats of bulls and rams, burning portions of the meat as offerings to the god, while distributing other portions to the worshippers and keeping some for themselves. The smell of burnt meat and incense hangs over the bursa, mixed with the songs of the priests and the rhythmic beating of drums and tambourines. Nearby stands another temple, dedicated to Tanit, the mother goddess, the face of Bella. Tanit is perhaps the most beloved deity in Carthage, a goddess of fertility, of the moon, of the city itself. Her symbol is everywhere, a triangle surmounted by a horizontal bar and a circle, a stylized representation of the goddess with her arms raised. Women especially worship Tanit, praying to her for children, for safe childbirth, for the health of their families. The temple of Tanit is also the site of a sacred prostitution, a practice attested in many ancient Near Eastern cultures. Young women, usually from wealthy families, serve for a time in the temple, offering themselves to male worshippers in acts that are considered both religious and sexual. The money earned goes to the temple, enriching the goddess. The practice is sacred, not shameful, though Greek and Roman writers will later describe it with shocked fascination, unable to reconcile their own sexual mores with those of the Carthaginians. And then there is the Tophet. This sacred precinct lies outside the main city walls, a walled enclosure perhaps 100 meters on a side. The ground is covered with small stone markers, stelae carved with inscriptions and symbols. Beneath many of these markers are buried urns containing the cremated remains of infants and young children. The inscriptions dedicate these remains to Tanit and to Beri el Haman, describing them as milk offerings, a term whose exact meaning is disputed. Did desperate parents, in times of plague or famine or military crisis, truly sacrifice their own children, burning them alive in the bronze arms of a statue of Beri el Haman, believing that such an offering would appease the gods and save the city? Or were these the burials of children who died naturally, given special honor in death, the milk offering a dedication of the body rather than a sacrifice of a living child? The archaeological evidence is ambiguous. The ancient texts, written by Greeks and Romans who despised Carthage, are unanimous in their condemnation, describing in lurid detail the supposed horrors of child sacrifice. But these texts are not neutral. They were written by enemies, by people who had every reason to portray the Carthaginians as barbaric, to justify the destruction that Rome would eventually inflict. Modern scholars are divided. Some argue that child sacrifice did occur, pointing to the large number of infant burials in the Tophet, far more than would be expected from natural mortality alone. Others argue that the burials are simply a form of infant cemetery, that the children died of disease or accident, and that the Romans invented or exaggerated the stories of sacrifice for propaganda purposes. The truth, lost in the ashes of 2 millennia, may never be known with certainty. What is certain is that the Tophet is a sacred place, a place of sorrow and devotion, a place where the people of Carthage made offerings to their gods, praying for the survival and prosperity of their city. As the morning wears on, and the sun climbs higher, the heat becomes oppressive. The city slows, shops close for a few hours, people retreat indoors or to shaded courtyards. This is the time for the main meal of the day. For the poor, this might be a simple affair: bread, olives, onions, perhaps a bit of fish or cheese. For the wealthy, it is an opportunity for display and indulgence. Servants bring platters of food to the triclinium, the dining room. The diners, male heads of households and their guests, recline on couches arranged around 3 sides of a low table. Women and children eat separately, in their own quarters. The meal begins with a libation, a prayer to the gods, wine poured onto the floor as an offering. Then the food is brought out: roasted meat, lamb or pork or poultry, seasoned with herbs and garum. There are vegetables, both cooked and raw. There is bread, baked fresh that morning. There are honey cakes and dates for dessert. Wine is served mixed with water in a large crater, a ceramic bowl. Drinking unmixed wine is considered barbaric, a practice of the uncivilized Gauls. The wine is often imported from Greek Sicily, or from the islands of the Aegean, though Carthaginian estates also produce respectable vintages. The meal lasts hours, a time for conversation, for business dealings, for the exchange of news and gossip. Afterward there is rest, a nap to escape the worst of the midday heat. As the afternoon wanes and the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, the city stirs again. The markets reopen. Business resumes. But the character of the late afternoon and evening is different, more social, less purely commercial. Men gather in public spaces to talk politics, philosophy, commerce. The Carthaginian government is an oligarchic republic, ruled by a small class of wealthy families. Political power is hereditary, passed from father to son within these families. But within this ruling class there is vigorous competition for influence and office. Men seek election to the various councils and magistracies, building networks of clients and supporters, exchanging favors, making alliances and feuds. The highest offices are the two suffetes, magistrates elected annually, roughly equivalent to the Roman consuls. The suffetes preside over the Senate, command the army in wartime, and represent the city in diplomatic matters. Below them are numerous lesser magistrates, responsible for specific functions, overseeing the markets, collecting taxes, administering justice, maintaining the city's infrastructure. The real power, however, lies with the Senate, a body composed of the heads of the leading families, and with an even more exclusive inner circle, sometimes called the Council of Elders, or the Council of Judges. These are the men who make the important decisions, who decide when to go to war and when to seek peace, who appoint generals and admirals, who control the public treasury. They meet in closed session, their deliberations secret, their decisions announced to the people as fate's accomplice. The common people of Carthage, the vast majority of the population, have little formal role in government. They do not vote in assemblies, as in Athens or Rome. They do not elect magistrates, but they are not entirely powerless. Public opinion matters. Unpopular policy can lead to riots. A failed general can be denounced in the streets, his house attacked by mobs. The government, while oligarchic, must maintain at least a degree of popular support, and the government ensures this support through various means. Grain is distributed at subsidized prices, ensuring that even the poor can eat. Public works projects provide employment. Religious festivals and games provide entertainment. The great temple sacrifices, with their distributions of meat, give even the poorest citizens a taste of luxury. Carthage is a city of stark inequalities, where a tiny elite controls vast wealth while many live in poverty. But it is also a city of opportunity, where a clever merchant can rise, where a brave soldier can win fortune in war, where the economic dynamism of trade creates possibilities for social mobility that are rare in the ancient world. As evening falls, the streets empty. Oil lamps and torches are lit in the wealthier districts, casting flickering shadows on the whitewashed walls. But most of the city is dark. The streets, narrow and twisting, become dangerous. Robbers and cutthroats lurk in the shadows. The city watch, armed men employed by the government, patrol the main thoroughfares and the walls, but they cannot be everywhere. Respectable people stay indoors. Families gather in their homes, eating a light evening meal, telling stories, preparing for sleep. Children are put to bed. Slaves are locked in their quarters. The doors are barred, and the city settles into an uneasy quiet, lit by the stars and the occasional torch waiting for the dawn. This is the rhythm of life in Carthage, day after day, season after season. It is a life oriented entirely toward commerce, toward the sea, toward the accumulation of wealth. The Carthaginians are not great philosophers or poets, at least not that we know of. They do not produce monumental sculpture or innovative architecture in the manner of the Greeks. What they produce is wealth, in quantities that astound the ancient world. And they use that wealth to build a navy, to hire armies, to expand their influence, to challenge rivals, to secure their position as the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. For centuries this system works. Carthage thrives. But the city is not without enemies. The Greeks, especially the powerful Greek city of Syracuse in Sicily, contest Carthaginian control of that island. Conflicts erupt periodically, brutal wars that drag on for years with no decisive outcome. And far to the north, on the Italian peninsula, a new power is rising, a city-state that is conquering its neighbors one by one, building a federation that will eventually challenge Carthage for supremacy. That city is Rome. And the conflict between Rome and Carthage, when it finally comes, will be the greatest and most destructive war the ancient Mediterranean has ever seen. Rivals and raiders. The Greek challenge in Sicily. The island of Sicily lies tantalizingly close to the North African coast, a large, fertile, mountainous land, visible on clear days from the hills above Carthage. The strait separating Sicily from Africa is less than 100 miles wide at its narrowest point. Control of this strait means control of the central Mediterranean, the ability to dominate the sea lanes between east and west. Both Carthage and the Greek cities of Sicily understood this perfectly. And so for centuries, they fought over the island, in a series of wars that were brutal, inconclusive, and extraordinarily expensive. The Greeks had arrived in Sicily in the 8th century BCE, establishing colonies along the eastern and southern coasts. Cities like Syracuse, Akragas, Gela, and Messana grew wealthy from agriculture and trade. They built in the Greek style, with stone temples, theaters, and agoras. They spoke Greek dialects, worshipped Greek gods, and considered themselves part of the wider Hellenic world. The Phoenicians, including Carthage, controlled the western tip of the island and parts of the northwest coast. Cities like Motia, Panormus, and Solus were Punic settlements, extensions of the Carthaginian commercial network. Between these zones lived the native Sicilian peoples, the Sicels and Sicanians, who were gradually absorbed or displaced by the more powerful colonizers. The first major conflicts between Carthage and the Greeks erupted in the early 5th century BCE. The Greek tyrant of Akragas, Theron, attacked the Carthaginian city of Himera on the northern coast of Sicily. Carthage responded by sending a massive expeditionary force under the command of Hamilcar, a general from one of the city's leading families. The army was huge by ancient standards, perhaps 50,000 men or more, composed of Carthaginian citizens, Libyan allies, Iberian mercenaries, and recruits from across the Punic world. They sailed across the strait in a fleet of transport ships and landed near Himera in 480 BCE. The Greeks, led by Gelon, the tyrant of Syracuse, marched to meet them. The Battle of Himera was a disaster for Carthage. The Greek hoplites, heavily armored infantry fighting in tight phalanx formation, smashed through the Carthaginian lines. Hamilcar himself was killed, though the circumstances of his death are unclear. Some sources claim he threw himself into the flames of a sacrificial fire when defeat became inevitable, offering himself to the gods. Others say he fell in battle. The Carthaginian army was routed, thousands killed or captured. The survivors fled to their ships and limped back to North Africa. The defeat was a profound humiliation, and Carthage would not attempt another major campaign in Sicily for 70 years. But Carthage did not abandon its Sicilian possessions. It maintained its western cities, rebuilt its strength, and waited for opportunity. That opportunity came in 410 BCE, when Segesta, a native Sicilian city, appealed to Carthage for help against its Greek rival Selinus. Carthage saw a chance to reassert its power and sent an army under Hannibal, the grandson of the Hamilcar who had died at Himera. This Hannibal was determined to avenge his grandfather's defeat and restore the family honor. He besieged and captured Selinus in a brutal assault, his soldiers sacking the city and massacring its inhabitants. Then he marched on Himera, the site of the great defeat 70 years earlier. He took the city after a brief siege and exacted a terrible revenge, slaughtering thousands of Greek prisoners on the spot where his grandfather had died. The Second Sicilian War had begun, a conflict that would drag on intermittently for generations. The Carthaginians and Syracusans were well matched. Syracuse had a larger citizen population and could field powerful armies of hoplites, supplemented by mercenaries and allies. Carthage had greater wealth and could hire larger mercenary forces. Syracuse had good generals, men like Dionysius the Elder, who fortified the city until it was nearly impregnable and built a powerful fleet. Carthage had its own talented commanders and the advantage of being able to resupply by sea. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. The war became a grinding stalemate, punctuated by sieges, naval battles, and brief truces. Cities changed hands. Thousands died. The island was devastated by armies marching back and forth, burning crops, tearing down olive trees, poisoning wells. And through it all, the native Sicilians suffered most, caught between two foreign powers fighting over their land. One tactic both sides employed was plague. Whether intentionally spread or simply the inevitable result of crowding armies together in unsanitary camps, epidemic disease killed more soldiers than battle. In 396 BCE, a plague ravaged the Carthaginian army besieging Syracuse, killing thousands including the general Himilco. The survivors were so weakened that they had to negotiate an ignominious peace, abandoning most of their conquests and returning to their western Sicilian strongholds. But within a few years the war resumed. It became a fact of life, a perpetual conflict that drained both powers but settled nothing. The pattern would continue into the 3rd century BCE, when a new player would enter the game and change everything. Masters of the waves, Carthaginian naval power and shipbuilding. To understand Carthaginian power, we must understand the ships that projected it across the Mediterranean. The sea was not just a highway for Carthage. It was a fortress, a farm, a battlefield, and a source of identity. The Carthaginians were sailors before they were anything else, and their mastery of naval technology and tactics was what made them a great power. The backbone of the Carthaginian navy was the quinquereme, a galley that superseded the earlier trireme as the standard warship of the Hellenistic age. The quinquereme, as its name suggests, had 5 rows of oars, though the exact arrangement is debated by scholars. The most likely configuration had 3 banks of oars, with 2 rowers on the upper oar and 1 each on the middle and lower oars, for a total of 5 men per vertical section. This arrangement gave the ship more power and speed than a trireme, while keeping the vessel manageable. A quinquereme was approximately 120 feet long and 16 feet wide, propelled by 300 rowers arranged in the banks on either side. Above the rowers' deck was a fighting platform where marines stood, armed with bows, javelins, swords, and shields. The primary weapon of the quinquereme, like all ancient warships, was the ram. This was a massive bronze casting, shaped like a 3-pronged battering ram, mounted at the waterline of the bow. The entire front of the ship was reinforced with heavy timbers to absorb the shock of ramming. In battle, a skilled commander would attempt to ram an enemy ship amidships, punching a hole through the planking. The sea would rush in, and the enemy vessel would sink within minutes. Alternatively, a quinquereme could sweep alongside an enemy, shearing off its oars and leaving it helpless. Once a ship was disabled, marines would board, fighting hand-to-hand on the narrow, pitching decks. But naval battles were not just about ramming. They were chaotic, brutal affairs involving dozens or hundreds of ships, clouds of arrows and javelins darkening the sky, the sea thick with debris and drowning men. The Carthaginians developed sophisticated tactics. They used their superior seamanship to outmaneuver opponents, to attack from the flanks and rear, to create breaks in enemy lines. They coordinated attacks with squadrons of ships working together. Their admirals, standing on the stern of flagships, used signals to communicate orders, flags during the day, torches at night, trumpet calls audible over the din of battle. The construction of these ships was a marvel of ancient engineering. Carthaginian shipwrights used mainly pine for the hull, a wood that was relatively lightweight and resistant to rot, though it had to be replaced every few years as the timber absorbed water and became heavy. The planks were edge-joined, fitted together with mortise and tenon joints, then fastened with bronze nails and dowels. The seams were caulked with fiber and pitch to make them watertight. The interior was filled with frames and ribs for strength. The deck was laid with planks, leaving openings for the masts and for ventilation to the rowers below. Building a quinquereme required massive amounts of timber, bronze, rope and canvas, plus the labor of skilled shipwrights, rope makers and sail makers. A single ship might take months to complete, but Carthage could build them by the dozens, its shipyards working continuously, its warehouses stocked with pre-cut timbers and standardized parts. In time of war, Carthage could expand its navy with astonishing speed, launching new ships as fast as they could be manned. And manning them was no small task. A quinquereme required 300 rowers, plus sailors to handle the sails and rigging, plus marines to fight. The rowers were not slaves, as is sometimes assumed. They were free men, professionals who trained for their role, who were paid wages and received bonuses for victories. Rowing a warship was grueling work, requiring strength, endurance, and perfect coordination. The rowers sat on benches, each man pulling a single oar. The oars were long and heavy, especially the upper oars which had to reach over the heads of the lower rowers. When the ship was underway, The rowers pulled in unison to the beat of a drum, their oars entering and leaving the water with practiced precision. Hour after hour, they pulled, their backs straining, their hands calloused and bleeding, the heat below decks suffocating. In battle, the rowing became even more intense, bursts of maximum effort to accelerate for a ram or to turn sharply to avoid enemy attack. It was exhausting, and rowers could not maintain peak effort for more than a few hours. Ancient naval battles were typically short, fierce affairs, decided in an afternoon, because the crews were simply too exhausted to continue. The Carthaginian fleet, when fully mobilized, numbered in the hundreds of ships. It was organized into squadrons, each under the command of an admiral or triarch. These officers were often from the wealthiest Carthaginian families, men who had the resources to outfit a ship and the political connections to secure a command. Naval service was prestigious, a path to glory and advancement. A successful admiral who won victories could rise to the highest levels of government, could be elected civet, could command armies as well as fleets. But failure was punished harshly. A defeated admiral might be recalled, tried, fined, exiled, or in extreme cases, executed. The Carthaginian government demanded results, and it was ruthless with those who failed to deliver. Into the unknown Hanno's voyage and the Atlantic frontier. Not all Carthaginian voyages were about trade or war. Some were about exploration, about pushing into the unknown, about discovering what lay beyond the familiar horizons. The most famous of these expeditions was the voyage of Hanno, a Carthaginian admiral who in the 6th or 5th century BCE sailed through the Pillars of Hercules and down the western coast of Africa, penetrating further south than any Mediterranean sailor had ever gone. The account of Hanno's voyage survives in a Greek translation, inscribed on a stone tablet and displayed in a Carthaginian temple. The original Punic text is lost, but the Greek version preserves the essential details, though it is frustratingly vague about distances and locations. Hanno, according to the account, commanded a fleet of 60 ships carrying 30,000 colonists, men and women, along with supplies and equipment to establish new settlements along the African coast. This was an expedition of colonization, an attempt to extend Carthaginian influence far beyond the Mediterranean into the Atlantic world. The fleet passed through the Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow passage between the limestone cliffs of Europe and the mountains of Africa. Ancient sailors called this the Pillars of Hercules, believing that the hero had set up the promontories as a boundary marker, a warning not to venture beyond. But the Carthaginians, pragmatic and curious, did venture beyond. They sailed south along the Moroccan coast, a forbidding shore where the Atlas Mountains rise steeply from the sea. The currents here are treacherous, the waves large, the winds often contrary. The fleet made several stops, establishing small colonies at strategic points. Settlers were left behind with supplies, instructions, and the promise that ships would return with trade goods and news. Then Hanno sailed on, into waters no Carthaginian had charted. The coast began to curve eastward, the mountains giving way to lower, more forested land. They reached the mouth of a great river, possibly the Senegal or the Gambia, where the fresh water flowed so far out to sea that they could fill their water jars without going ashore. They encountered peoples who spoke languages no one in the fleet could understand, who lived in villages of circular huts thatched with reeds, who fished from small dugout canoes and farmed the river valleys. Hanno's interpreters, who spoke Berber and perhaps some West African languages, tried to communicate, but understanding was limited. The locals were sometimes welcoming, sometimes hostile, depending on the village and the circumstance. As the fleet continued south, the landscape changed again. They saw forests filled with strange animals, elephants far larger than those of North Africa, hippopotamuses, wallowing in rivers, crocodiles sunning themselves on muddy banks. At night, they heard the sounds of the forest, the roaring of beasts, the calls of unknown birds, the rhythmic beating of drums from villages in the interior. Once they saw fires burning along the shore, great conflagrations that lit up the night sky. Whether these were wildfires or controlled burns by local peoples clearing land, the account does not say. The sailors, far from home and deep in unknown territory, were unnerved. Some wanted to turn back, but Hanno pressed on. They reached a bay dominated by a great mountain, which Hanno called the Chariot of the Gods. The mountain seemed to be on fire, with flames and smoke pouring from its summit. Modern scholars believe this may have been Mount Cameroon, an active volcano that rises directly from the coast, or possibly a large forest fire that appeared to Hanno and his men as a burning mountain. Whatever it was, the sight was impressive and terrifying. Further on, they encountered islands inhabited by wild, hairy creatures that Hanno's interpreters called gorillae. The sailors attempted to capture some of these creatures, but the males were too strong and fierce. They managed to capture 3 females, but the creatures fought so violently that they had to be killed. Their skins were taken back to Carthage and displayed in a temple where they remained for centuries, a curiosity from the far south. Were these actually gorillas, or chimpanzees, or perhaps a tribe of humans, viewed through the lens of fear and incomprehension and described as beasts? We cannot know for certain. What is certain is that Hanno had reached a point far down the West African coast, a distance of thousands of miles from Carthage, perhaps as far south as Gabon or the Gulf of Guinea. Then, with supplies running dangerously low and his crews exhausted and frightened by the strangeness of the lands they were seeing, Hanno made the decision to turn back. The return voyage was long and difficult, fighting contrary winds and currents, but the fleet made it home. Hanno presented his report to the Carthaginian Senate, and it was inscribed on a tablet for public display. The colonies he had established apparently did not survive, too isolated, too vulnerable to local hostility or to disease. But the voyage itself remained legendary, a demonstration of Carthaginian daring and seamanship, a penetration into the unknown that would not be matched by Europeans for nearly 2 millennia. The gathering storm, Carthage, Rome, and the approach of conflict. By the 3rd century BCE, the balance of power in the Mediterranean was shifting. Carthage remained the dominant naval power in the west, but it faced increasingly serious challenges. In Sicily, the wars with Syracuse continued, draining resources and achieving nothing decisive. In North Africa, Berber tribes occasionally rebelled against Carthaginian rule, requiring military expeditions to pacify them. And in Italy, a new power was rising that would fundamentally alter the political landscape of the ancient world. Rome in 300 BCE was still a relatively minor city-state, one of many on the Italian peninsula. But it was a city with unique characteristics. Its political system, a republic governed by a senate of aristocrats and 2 annually elected consuls, was stable and effective. Its army, based on citizen soldiers organized into legions, was disciplined and adaptable. And most importantly, Rome had a policy toward defeated enemies that was unusual in the ancient world. Rather than simply extracting tribute and leaving conquered cities to stew in resentment, Rome offered a path to incorporation. Defeated enemies could become Roman allies, retaining local autonomy but contributing soldiers to Roman armies and accepting Roman leadership in foreign policy. Over time, some allies could even gain Roman citizenship. This created a federation, a system that turned former enemies into stakeholders in Roman success. Using this system, Rome methodically conquered the Italian peninsula. The Etruscans, the Samnites, the Greek cities of the south, all were defeated and incorporated. By 270 BCE, Rome controlled all of Italy south of the Po River, a territory with a population of perhaps 4 million people. This gave Rome an enormous pool of military manpower, far larger than Carthage could muster from its own citizen body. The 2 powers were now neighbors, separated only by the narrow Strait of Messina between Italy and Sicily. Their spheres of influence overlapped. Conflict seemed inevitable. The spark came in 264 BCE, in the most unpredictable way. A group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines, sons of Mars, had seized the city of Messana on the northeastern tip of Sicily. They ruled the city as brigands, raiding the surrounding territory. Both Syracuse and Carthage decided to put an end to this nuisance and moved forces against Messana. The Mamertines, desperate, appealed to Rome for help. The Roman Senate debated. Some senators argued that helping bandits who had seized a city by treachery was dishonorable. Others pointed out that if Carthage and Syracuse divided Sicily between them, Roman interests in the region would be threatened. Eventually, the faction favoring intervention won. Rome sent an army across the strait to Messana. Carthage, viewing this as a violation of the existing treaty that had divided their spheres of influence, protested. Rome ignored the protests. Both sides began to mobilize. In 264 BCE, the First Punic War began. It would last 23 years, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and change the Mediterranean world forever. The First Punic War was unlike anything that had come before. It was a total war, a conflict waged on land and sea, involving massive armies and fleets spanning decades. The Romans, who had never fought a major naval war, built a fleet by copying a captured Carthaginian quinquereme. They constructed hundreds of ships in a matter of months, training crews who had never rowed a warship, equipping them with a Roman innovation called the corvus, a boarding bridge that could be dropped onto an enemy ship, allowing Roman infantry to cross and fight hand to hand. The Carthaginians, confident in their naval superiority, were taken by surprise. In the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, a Roman fleet defeated a Carthaginian force, capturing dozens of ships. It was a stunning upset. Rome, the land power, had beaten Carthage at sea. But the Carthaginians were far from finished. They rebuilt their fleet, improved their tactics, and struck back. Over the next 2 decades, massive naval battles were fought, each involving hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. The Romans won some, the Carthaginians won others. Both sides lost entire fleets to storms. The waters around Sicily became a graveyard of ships, the seafloor littered with bronze rams and the bones of drowned sailors. On land, the war was a grinding stalemate. Roman legions and Carthaginian mercenary armies clashed repeatedly, neither able to achieve a decisive victory. Cities changed hands. The Sicilian countryside was devastated by years of campaigning. The Carthaginian general in Sicily for much of the war was Hamilcar Barca, father of the future Hannibal. Hamilcar was a brilliant and aggressive commander, a man who refused to accept defeat even when the situation seemed hopeless. He waged a guerrilla campaign from the mountains of western Sicily, raiding Roman supply lines, ambushing columns, keeping his small army intact and dangerous. But Carthage, politically divided and exhausted by the cost of the war, did not provide the resources Hamilcar needed. The Carthaginian fleet was defeated in a final great battle off the Agates Islands in 241 BCE. With their navy destroyed and no money to rebuild it, the Carthaginian government sued for peace. The terms were harsh. Carthage had to evacuate Sicily entirely, abandoning the cities and territories it had held for centuries. It had to pay Rome an indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years, an enormous sum. Hamilcar Barca, the only Carthaginian general who had not been defeated, was furious. He felt betrayed by his own government, by the Senate that had starved him of resources and then sued for peace. He returned to Carthage, bitter and determined. He would not forget this humiliation, and he would raise his son, young Hannibal, to ensure that Carthage would have its revenge on Rome. The stage was set for an even greater and more terrible conflict, a war that would bring Rome to the edge of annihilation and would be remembered as one of the greatest military epics in history. Continuing with Hannibal, the Second Punic War, and the final destruction of Carthage to reach the target word count. The oath of eternal enmity, young Hannibal and the Barcid dynasty in Spain. When Hamilcar Barca returned to Carthage after the First Punic War, he found a city in turmoil. The mercenary soldiers who had fought for Carthage in Sicily had not been paid. When they demanded their wages, the Carthaginian government, bankrupted by the war and the indemnity owed to Rome, tried to negotiate a reduction. The mercenaries, enraged, rebelled. They were joined by Libyan conscripts and by some of the African subjects who saw an opportunity to throw off Carthaginian rule. What followed was the Mercenary War, a brutal 3-year conflict that nearly destroyed Carthage. The rebels besieged the city itself, cutting off supply lines, threatening to storm the walls. Hamilcar, appointed to command the Carthaginian forces, conducted a brilliant campaign, dividing the rebel forces, defeating them in detail, showing no mercy to prisoners. He was ruthless and effective. By 238 BCE, the rebellion was crushed, its leaders executed, and Carthaginian control over North Africa restored. But the war had revealed the fragility of Carthage's power and the unreliability of mercenary forces. Hamilcar understood that Carthage needed a new source of wealth and manpower, something to replace the lost revenues of Sicily, and to provide a military base independent of the unreliable oligarchs in Carthage. He looked to Spain. The Iberian Peninsula was rich in silver, its mines producing metal in quantities that could fund armies and fleets. It was also inhabited by fierce but disunited tribes who might be conquered and recruited into Carthaginian service. Hamilcar proposed to the Carthaginian Senate that he lead an expedition to Spain to expand Carthaginian influence there. The Senate, relieved to have him gone and happy to exploit Spanish resources, agreed. Before he sailed, Hamilcar performed a ceremony that would echo through history. He took his young son Hannibal, then 9 years old, to the temple of Baal Hammon. Inside the temple, before the statue of the god, he made the boy place his hand on the sacrificial altar. Then, according to legend, he made Hannibal swear an oath. The boy swore that he would never be a friend to Rome, that he would be Rome's enemy for as long as he lived, that he would work all his days to humble the city that had humiliated Carthage. Whether this oath was sworn in precisely these terms, whether it happened exactly as described, we cannot know with certainty. The story comes to us from later sources, Roman writers who heard it from Hannibal himself many years later. But even if the details are embellished, the essential truth is clear. Hannibal was raised from childhood with a single consuming purpose: to avenge his father's defeat and to destroy the power of Rome. Everything in his life would be oriented toward this goal. It would be his obsession, his motivation, his reason for being. In 237 BCE, Hamilcar sailed to Spain with his family, including young Hannibal, and a small army. Over the next 9 years he conducted a brilliant campaign of conquest. He defeated tribe after tribe, pushing inland from the coast, securing the rich silver mines of the interior. He founded new cities, including Acroluc, a fortified port that became a base of operations. He trained his army constantly, hardening them with continuous campaigning, forging them into a cohesive force loyal to him personally, rather than to the distant oligarchs of Carthage. He married his daughters to Numidian princes, securing alliances with the Berber cavalry that would become famous in his son's campaigns. He was building a power base, a military machine, and a dynasty. Hamilcar died in 229 BCE. Killed in battle against a Spanish tribe, command of the army passed to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, who continued the work of consolidation. Hasdrubal founded New Carthage, Carthago Nova, a fortified city with an excellent harbor that became the capital of Carthaginian Spain. He negotiated a treaty with Rome, agreeing that the Ebro River would be the northern boundary of Carthaginian influence in Spain. Rome, preoccupied with wars in northern Italy against the Gauls, was content with this arrangement. The situation seemed stable. Then, in 221 BCE, Hasdrubal was assassinated by a Celtic slave seeking revenge for a personal grievance. The army, assembled to choose a new commander, acclaimed Hannibal, now 26 years old. The Carthaginian Senate, presented with a fait accompli, confirmed the appointment. Hannibal was now in control of the most powerful military force Carthage had ever assembled, an army of veterans hardened by years of Spanish campaigning, supplemented by the best cavalry in the Mediterranean, supported by the wealth of Spanish silver mines. He was also a man consumed by the oath he had sworn as a child, a man who had spent his entire life preparing for war against Rome. For 2 years Hannibal consolidated his control over Spain, completing the conquest of the interior. Then, in 219 BCE, he besieged Saguntum, a city on the east coast of Spain that was allied to Rome. The siege lasted 8 months. Saguntum, perched on a rocky hill, was strongly fortified, and its defenders fought with desperate courage. Hannibal himself was wounded in the thigh by a javelin early in the siege and had to direct operations from a litter while his wound healed. But he was patient and relentless. He built siege towers, had mines dug under the walls, and subjected the city to a constant barrage from catapults and ballista. Finally, the walls were breached. Hannibal's soldiers poured into the city. The population, knowing what was coming, set fire to their own homes and threw themselves into the flames rather than be captured. The city was sacked thoroughly, its treasures divided among the soldiers, its survivors sold into slavery. Saguntum had appealed to Rome for help, but the Romans, distracted by other concerns, sent only ambassadors who arrived too late. When news of the city's fall reached Rome, there was outrage. Saguntum was a Roman ally. Its destruction was an insult and a violation of Rome's dignity. The Roman Senate sent ambassadors to Carthage, demanding that Hannibal be handed over for punishment. The Carthaginian Senate, meeting in emergency session, debated. Some senators, mindful of the disastrous cost of the First Punic War, urged conciliation. Others, inspired by Hannibal's victories and by the wealth flowing from Spain, argued for defiance. In the end, the faction supporting Hannibal prevailed. The Carthaginian Senate refused the Roman demand. The Roman ambassador, a man named Fabius, stood before the assembled senators and gathered his toga into a fold, creating a pouch. "In here," he said, "I carry peace and war, choose which you will have." The Carthaginians told him to choose for them. Fabius let the fold of his toga fall open, symbolically releasing war. "Then you shall have war," he said. And so in 218 BCE, the Second Punic War began, a conflict that would rage for 17 years and bring the Roman Republic to the brink of annihilation. The impossible march, Hannibal's crossing of the Alps. The Romans assumed the war would be fought in two theaters: Spain, where one Roman army would engage Hannibal's forces, and North Africa, where another Roman army would land and threaten Carthage directly. They prepared accordingly, assembling two consular armies, each composed of 2 legions plus allied Italian troops, approximately 25,000 men each. One army, under the consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was sent to Sicily to prepare for an invasion of Africa. The other, under the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, was sent to southern Gaul with orders to march into Spain and confront Hannibal there. The Romans were confident. Their legions had proven themselves against the Gauls and the Greeks. They had the manpower to field multiple armies simultaneously. They had control of the sea. They believed they could contain Hannibal in Spain, while their other army forced Carthage to sue for peace. They did not anticipate what Hannibal would do next. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal assembled his army at New Carthage. It was a formidable force, approximately 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and most famously, 37 war elephants. The infantry was a mix of Iberians, Libyans, and a corps of Carthaginian citizens. The cavalry included Numidian light horse, unmatched skirmishers and pursuers, and heavier Spanish and Carthaginian cavalry for shock charges. The elephants were North African forest elephants, smaller than their Indian cousins but still formidable weapons of war, capable of breaking enemy formations by their sheer size and the terror they inspired. Hannibal's plan was audacious to the point of madness. He would not wait for the Romans to invade Spain or attack Carthage. He would take the war to Italy, directly to the heart of Roman power. But between Spain and Italy lay hundreds of miles of hostile territory: southern Gaul, filled with warlike Celtic tribes, and then the Alps, the great mountain range that had never been crossed by an army. Most people considered the Alps impassable. The few trails that led through the passes were narrow, treacherous, blocked by snow most of the year, and guarded by mountain tribes who tolerated no trespassers. But Hannibal believed it could be done. If he could cross the Alps, he could bring his army into northern Italy, into the Po Valley where Celtic tribes hostile to Rome might join him. He could threaten Rome from the north, where the Romans would least expect him, and he could sever Rome's connection to its northern territories. It was a strategy of surprise and audacity, relying on speed, deception, and the discipline of his veteran soldiers. In May, the army marched out of New Carthage, moving north and west along the coast. Hannibal left his brother Hasdrubal in command in Spain with a substantial garrison. The march through northeastern Spain was opposed by several tribes, and Hannibal had to fight his way through, losing men in skirmishes and ambushes. By the time the army reached the Pyrenees, the mountains separating Spain from Gaul, it had already been reduced to perhaps 45,000 men. Hannibal left another garrison to secure the passes, then pushed on into southern Gaul. The march through Gaul took 2 months. Some tribes, bribed or intimidated, allowed the army safe passage. Others resisted and had to be fought. The Volcae, a powerful Celtic people who controlled the lower Rhone River, assembled an army to block Hannibal's crossing. Hannibal sent a detachment upstream to cross the river unobserved, then launched a frontal assault while the detachment attacked the Volcae from the rear. The tribe was routed, and the Carthaginian army crossed the Rhone. It was during this crossing that Hannibal demonstrated his logistical genius. Getting the infantry and cavalry across was difficult but manageable. Getting 37 elephants across a wide, fast-flowing river was another matter entirely. Hannibal had massive rafts constructed, covered with earth to resemble solid ground. The elephants, led by their handlers, walked onto these rafts, which were then towed across by boats. Some elephants panicked and fell into the water, drowning their handlers but managing to reach the far shore by walking along the riverbed, using their trunks as snorkels. It was an extraordinary feat of engineering and animal management. The Roman consul Scipio, who had landed with his army at Massalia, learned of Hannibal's presence and marched rapidly to intercept him. But Hannibal, moving faster than expected, had already left the Rhone, heading north and then east toward the Alps. Scipio, realizing he had missed his chance, sent his army on to Spain under his brother's command and returned to Italy to prepare for Hannibal's arrival. Hannibal, meanwhile, was pushing his army through the foothills of the Alps, following the valley of a river, possibly the Isère, toward the high passes. The weather was deteriorating. It was late September, and the first snows had already fallen in the high mountains. The army was entering a landscape of terrifying grandeur, towering peaks, narrow valleys, icy streams, forests of pine and fir, and they were entering hostile territory. The mountain tribes, the Allobroges and others, watched the army's approach with suspicion and greed. Here was a rich target, thousands of soldiers laden with baggage, slowed by the terrain, vulnerable. The attacks began as soon as the army entered the mountains. Warriors rolled boulders down from the heights, crushing men and pack animals. They ambushed the column at narrow points, killing stragglers, stealing supplies. Hannibal fought back, sending light troops to secure the heights before the main column passed through, setting ambushes of his own, showing no mercy to prisoners. But the harassment continued, and every day the army grew smaller, weaker, more strung out. The trail climbed higher and higher. The air grew thin, breathing became difficult. Soldiers from the warm climates of Africa and Spain had never experienced cold like this. They wore light clothing, tunics and cloaks and sandals. Now they were marching through snow, frostbiting their feet, their hands numb, their lips cracked and bleeding. The elephants suffered terribly. These animals, accustomed to the warm plains of North Africa, were completely unsuited to the alpine environment. Their thick skin and advantage in the heat offered little protection against cold. They could not feed properly. The vegetation was sparse and unfamiliar. They slowed the march, their huge feet slipping on the icy trails, their handlers struggling to keep them moving. Some fell from the trail, tumbling hundreds of feet down the rocky slopes, their trumpeting screams echoing through the valleys. But Hannibal refused to leave them behind. The elephants were weapons, psychological as much as physical, and he needed them for the battles to come. The worst moment came near the summit of the pass, at the highest point of the crossing. The trail here was narrow, barely wide enough for a single man, cut into the side of a cliff with a sheer drop on one side, and the trail was blocked. An avalanche or a rock slide had covered the path with boulders and rubble. The army came to a halt. They could not go forward, and they could not go back. The pass behind them was choked with the rest of the column, stretching back for miles. Hannibal ordered his engineers to clear the trail. For hours the soldiers worked, moving rocks by hand, levering boulders aside. But the way forward was still impassable. The rock face of the cliff, exposed where the trail had collapsed, was too sheer to climb, too hard to cut. Hannibal made a decision that showed both his desperation and his resourcefulness. He ordered fires to be lit against the rock face. For hours the fires burned, heating the stone. Then, when the rock was hot, Hannibal ordered his men to pour vinegar on it, the acidic liquid carried up from the valley in every spare container. The vinegar, reacting with the heated rock, caused it to crack and split. The soldiers then attacked the cracked rock with picks and iron tools, breaking it into pieces that could be moved. It took a day and a night, but finally a path was cleared. The army moved forward. 15 days after entering the high mountains, Hannibal's army emerged onto the plains of northern Italy, descending from the pass into the valley of the Po River. They had done it. They had crossed the Alps, achieving what everyone had said was impossible, but the cost was staggering. Of the 50,000 men who had left Spain, only 26,000 reached Italy. Half the army was gone, dead from battle, from cold, from falls, from disease, from exhaustion. The cavalry had been reduced to 6,000. The elephants, once 37, were down to perhaps 20. Most of them sick and weak. The survivors were exhausted, frostbitten, hungry. They looked more like scarecrows than soldiers, their clothes in rags, their faces gaunt. But they were in Italy, and Hannibal's eyes were fixed on Rome. Now the real war would begin. The war in Italy, terror and triumph. Hannibal spent several weeks resting his army and recruiting among the Gauls of the Po Valley. The Gallic tribes, who had been fighting Rome for generations, saw Hannibal as a liberator, or at least as a useful ally. Thousands of young Gallic warriors joined his army, bringing his numbers back up to approximately 40,000. The Romans, meanwhile, were mobilizing. The consul Scipio, who had returned from Gaul, assembled his legions and marched north to confront the invader. The two armies met near the Ticinus River in November 218 BCE. The Battle of Ticinus was not a major engagement, just a cavalry skirmish, but it was psychologically significant. Hannibal's Numidian cavalry, light horsemen armed with javelins, drew the Roman cavalry forward, then retreated, leading them into a trap. Heavier Carthaginian and Spanish cavalry hit the Romans from the flanks, routing them. Scipio himself was wounded, a spear thrust that nearly killed him. He was saved only by the courage of his 17-year-old son, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who rode into the chaos and rescued his father. The Romans retreated, shaken. News of the defeat spread through northern Italy. More Gauls flocked to Hannibal's banner. The Romans were not defeated, merely bloodied. They recalled the other consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, from Sicily. He marched north with his legions, and the two consular armies united, creating a force of perhaps 36,000 Roman and Italian troops. They positioned themselves on the west bank of the Trebia River, watching Hannibal's army encamped on the opposite bank. It was December, and the weather was turning cold. The Trebia, swollen with winter rains, was a formidable obstacle. Hannibal decided to force a battle on his terms. He sent a small force of Numidian cavalry across the river at dawn to provoke the Romans. The Numidians rode up to the Roman camp, hurling javelins, shouting insults. The Roman cavalry rode out to chase them off, and a running fight developed. Consul Sempronius, eager for glory, saw an opportunity. He ordered the entire army to cross the river and engage. It was exactly what Hannibal wanted. The Romans splashed across the Trebia in the freezing water, the current waist-deep, the cold numbing. They reached the far bank, formed their battle line, and advanced. Hannibal's army, which had been fed a hot breakfast and was ready and waiting, met them. The battle seemed evenly matched at first. The Roman legions, despite the cold, fought with their usual discipline. But Hannibal had laid a trap. His brother Mago, with 2,000 picked men, infantry and cavalry, had hidden during the night in a ravine covered with brush, a mile behind the Roman position. As the battle raged, Mago led his men out of hiding and attacked the Roman rear. The legions, suddenly assailed from behind, panicked. The formation broke. What had been a battle became a massacre. 15,000 Romans died in the freezing water of the Trebia or were cut down as they fled. Only 10,000, a solid block of legionary infantry that fought its way straight through the Carthaginian center, managed to escape. Sempronius was among the survivors, but his army was destroyed. Hannibal did not pursue. His own army had suffered casualties, and he needed to rest and refit. He led his troops into winter quarters in the Po Valley, spending the cold months recruiting more Gauls and training his men. The Romans, stunned by two defeats, spent the winter raising new legions, fortifying cities, and arguing about strategy. In the spring, Hannibal marched south. His route took him through the Arno marshes, a vast swamp in Etruria, north of Rome. It was the most direct route, but also the most difficult. For 4 days and 3 nights, the army waded through stagnant water, unable to rest, plagued by mosquitoes. Men and animals collapsed from exhaustion and drowned in the muck. Hannibal himself contracted an eye infection from the filthy water, an infection that cost him the sight in one eye. But once again he achieved surprise, emerging from the swamp into the fertile farmlands of Etruria, bypassing the Roman defenses entirely. The consul Gaius Flaminius, a populist politician with military ambitions, was enraged. He had been positioned to block the passes through the Apennines, but Hannibal had outmaneuvered him. Flaminius marched his army in pursuit, determined to bring Hannibal to battle and win glory. Hannibal, aware of Flaminius's character and eager to exploit it, chose his ground carefully. On the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, the road passed through a narrow defile, with the lake on one side and wooded hills on the other. Hannibal marched his army through the defile and made camp at the far end in full view of any Roman scouts. Then he hid the bulk of his forces in the hills overlooking the road, positioning them carefully among the trees and in the folds of the terrain. At dawn on June 21, 217 BCE, a thick fog lay over the lake. Flaminius, seeing Hannibal's camp ahead and eager to catch the Carthaginians before they could escape, ordered his army to advance. The Roman column, strung out in marching order, entered the defile. The legion was singing, confident, eager for battle. The fog muffled sound, creating an eerie quiet. Then, when the Roman vanguard had nearly reached Hannibal's camp and the bulk of the column was fully committed to the narrow defile, Hannibal gave the signal. Trumpets blared. Thousands of Carthaginian soldiers rushed down from the hills, attacking the Roman column from all sides. The Romans, caught in marching order, could not form a proper battle line. The fog added to the confusion. Units became separated. Officers could not see what was happening. The legionaries fought desperately, in small groups, back to back, but they were surrounded and outnumbered. Thousands were driven into the lake and drowned, weighed down by their armor. Flaminius himself, trying to rally his men, was killed by a Gallic warrior who recognized him by his armor and insignia. By midday, it was over. 15,000 Romans lay dead. Another 10,000, who had managed to fight their way to a nearby hilltop, were surrounded and forced to surrender. Hannibal lost perhaps 2,000 men. It was one of the greatest ambushes in military history, a tactical masterpiece, and all of Italy was now open before Hannibal. The Romans, reeling from this third catastrophic defeat, appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, a cautious, experienced senator. Fabius adopted a strategy that would bear his name: Fabian tactics. He refused to give Hannibal the decisive battle he sought. Instead, he shadowed the Carthaginian army, keeping to the high ground, harassing foraging parties, cutting off stragglers, but never offering battle. He was buying time, hoping that Hannibal's army, isolated in hostile territory, would eventually wither away from attrition and lack of supplies. Hannibal marched up and down Italy, through Campania, Apulia, ravaging the countryside, besieging towns, trying to lure Fabius into a fight. But the dictator would not take the bait. The Roman people, frustrated by Fabius's caution, called him the delayer, and not as a compliment. When Fabius's term expired, the Romans elected new consuls who promised decisive action. In the summer of 216 BCE, Rome assembled the largest army it had ever fielded, 8 full legions plus an equal number of allied troops, a total of perhaps 86,000 men. They marched south to the town of Cannae, where Hannibal had seized a Roman supply depot. The two armies faced each other on a flat, open plain, ideal for Roman infantry tactics. The Roman commanders, the consuls Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, were confident. They outnumbered Hannibal's army nearly 2-1. Their plan was simple: mass the legions in the center, deepen the formation to increase the weight of the assault, and smash straight through the Carthaginian line. It was a sound plan, and against any other general, it might have worked. But Hannibal was not any other general. On the morning of August 2, 216 BCE, he arranged his army in a crescent formation, with his weakest troops, Gallic and Iberian infantry, in the center. These men were lightly armed, wearing leather armor or none at all, armed with long swords or spears. To either side of this weak center, Hannibal placed his heavy African infantry, veteran troops equipped with captured Roman arms and armor taken from previous battles. On the wings he stationed his cavalry, Numidian light horse on the right, heavier Spanish and Gallic cavalry on the left. The Romans advanced, their legions a solid mass of bronze and iron, their discipline perfect. The Carthaginian center bent backward under the weight of the Roman assault, exactly as Hannibal had planned. The crescent became a concave arc, then a deep curve, then a pocket. The Romans, sensing victory, pressed forward, driving deeper into the Carthaginian line. The front ranks of the legion were pushing so hard that the rear ranks could barely move, pressed together by the momentum of the attack. At that moment, Hannibal signaled his flanks. The African heavy infantry, which had been standing at an angle to the line of battle, wheeled inward, attacking the Roman flanks. Simultaneously, the Carthaginian cavalry, having routed the Roman horse, attacked the Roman rear. The legions, packed so tightly that individual soldiers could barely lift their weapons, suddenly found themselves surrounded. They could not maneuver. They could not retreat. They could only fight and die. For hours, the killing went on. The Romans fought with desperate courage, but they were trapped. 50,000 Roman soldiers died that day, including both consuls, 80 senators, and the flower of Roman aristocracy. Hannibal lost perhaps 6,000 men. Cannae was a masterpiece, a battle studied by military commanders for the next 2,000 years. It should have ended the war, but it did not. Rome, faced with annihilation, did not surrender. It did not even seek peace terms. Instead, it grimly mobilized its remaining resources. Slaves were freed and armed. Boys too young for service were enrolled. Old men were recalled to the standards. New legions were raised. Fabius's strategy of delay and attrition was adopted as official policy. Rome would not face Hannibal in open battle again. Instead, they would wear him down, year by year, until he could no longer sustain his army in Italy. Hannibal, for his part, had won the battle but not the war. He could not besiege Rome itself. His army lacked the siege equipment and the numbers to invest such a large fortified city. He hoped that Rome's Italian allies, seeing his victories, would defect and join him. Some did, most notably Capua, the second city of Italy. But most remained loyal to Rome, bound by centuries of alliance, fear of retribution, and the understanding that Rome, even defeated, was a dangerous enemy. For the next 13 years Hannibal remained in southern Italy, a wolf among sheep, dangerous but increasingly isolated, and slowly, inexorably, Rome began to grind him down. The tide turns, Scipio in Spain and the road to Zama. While Hannibal waged his brilliant but ultimately futile campaign in Italy, the war was being decided elsewhere. In Spain, the Romans had sent armies to cut off Hannibal's base of support and to prevent reinforcements from reaching him. The initial Roman commanders were successful, winning several battles and pushing the Carthaginians back. But in 211 BC, both Roman commanders, the Scipio brothers, were killed in battle on the same day, their armies destroyed. It seemed that Spain would be lost. Then a young Roman general volunteered to take command. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of the consul who had been wounded at Tessinus, the youth who had saved his father's life. He was only 25 years old, technically too young to hold high command. But the Roman people, desperate for a capable leader, elected him to a special proconsular command in Spain. Scipio was a military genius in his own right, a student of Hannibal's tactics, a man who understood that Rome could not defeat Carthage by simply repeating the same strategies that had failed. He arrived in Spain with reinforcements and immediately began planning an audacious strike. In 209 BCE, Scipio launched an amphibious assault on New Carthage, the capital of Carthaginian Spain. The city was strongly fortified with walls and towers and a garrison of 1,000 soldiers. But Scipio had learned that the lagoon on one side of the city, which seemed to protect it, was actually fordable at low tide. While a Roman force attacked the main gate, drawing the defenders there, Scipio led a picked force through the lagoon at low tide, scaling the walls on the undefended side. The city fell in a single day. The Carthaginians lost their main base in Spain, along with vast quantities of supplies, silver, and hostages. Over the next 4 years, Scipio methodically defeated the Carthaginian armies in Spain, winning battles through superior tactics and maneuver. By 206 BCE, Spain was lost to Carthage. The silver mines that had funded Hannibal's campaigns were now in Roman hands. Scipio then proposed a bold plan: invade North Africa directly, striking at Carthage itself. The Roman Senate was cautious, but they gave him permission to raise an army and sail to Africa. In 204 BCE, Scipio landed near Carthage with 2 legions and allied troops. The city panicked. For the first time in the war, Carthage itself was under threat. The Carthaginian Senate recalled Hannibal from Italy. In 203 BCE, after 15 years in Italy, Hannibal sailed home. He had never been defeated on Italian soil, but he had not won the war. The final confrontation came in 202 BCE at the town of Zama, inland from Carthage. The 2 greatest generals of the age faced each other. Hannibal had the larger army, perhaps 45,000 men, including war elephants. But his troops were largely raw recruits, and his cavalry was outnumbered. Scipio had learned from Hannibal's tactics. When the Carthaginian elephants charged, the Roman infantry opened lanes, allowing the beasts to pass harmlessly through. Scipio's Numidian cavalry, allies he had carefully cultivated, defeated the Carthaginian horse and then attacked the Carthaginian infantry from the rear, repeating Hannibal's own tactic from Cannae. Hannibal's army was destroyed. He escaped with his life, but the war was lost. Carthage sued for peace, and the terms were devastating. Carthage was stripped of all its overseas territories, forced to hand over its navy, forbidden from waging war without Roman permission, and required to pay an indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver over 50 years. The empire was gone, the military power broken, the city reduced to a Roman client state. Continuing to the final sections on Hannibal's exile, Carthage's recovery, the Third Punic War, and the destruction, exile and death, the last years of Hannibal. After the defeat at Zama, Hannibal returned to Carthage, not as a defeated general to be blamed and punished, but as the only leader capable of salvaging something from the wreckage. In a surprising turn, he was elected Scythe, chief magistrate of Carthage, in 196 BCE. He used this position not to plan revenge, but to reform. Hannibal understood that Carthage had to pay the crushing indemnity imposed by Rome, and that the city's corrupt oligarchic system was incapable of raising the necessary funds. He set about reforming the tax system, rooting out embezzlement and streamlining the administration. He broke the power of the Council of Judges, the secretive inner circle that had dominated Carthaginian politics for generations. He made the magistracies annual rather than lifetime appointments, preventing the accumulation of entrenched power. His reforms worked. Within a few years, Carthage was not only paying its indemnity on time but actually prospering again, its economy recovering from the devastation of war. But Hannibal's reforms made him enemies among the wealthy elite whose corruption he had exposed. These oligarchs, preferring the old system where they could embezzle public funds with impunity, conspired against him. They sent secret messages to Rome, warning that Hannibal was secretly rimming, that he was plotting another war, that he was corresponding with Rome's enemies in the east. The accusations were likely false, or at least exaggerated, but Rome chose to believe them. The Senate sent ambassadors to Carthage, demanding that Hannibal be extradited to face charges. Hannibal, learning of this demand before it was made public, fled the city in the night. He was 50 years old, and he would never see Carthage again. For the next 13 years, Hannibal wandered the eastern Mediterranean, a king in exile, a general without an army. He went first to Tyre, the ancient Phoenician motherland, where he was received with honor but could not stay safely. He traveled to Ephesus, to the court of Antiochus III, the Seleucid king who ruled much of the former Persian Empire. Antiochus was planning a war against Rome, and he welcomed Hannibal's advice. Hannibal urged him to invade Italy, to take the war to Roman soil as he had done. He offered to return to Carthage and raise the city in revolt, to open a second front, but Antiochus did not trust him fully and did not give him a command commensurate with his abilities. When war came in 192 BCE, Hannibal was given a small fleet and sent on a minor mission. The Romans defeated Antiochus decisively, first in Greece and then in Asia Minor. Hannibal's fleet was defeated in a naval battle off the coast of Asia. He escaped, but his reputation as an invincible commander was tarnished. He fled again, this time to Crete, then to Armenia, seeking refuge in increasingly remote courts. He advised kings, helped plan fortifications, lived on the charity and hospitality of hosts who were honored to shelter the famous Hannibal Barca, but who could not protect him forever. Rome's reach was long, and Rome did not forget. Finally, in 183 BCE, Hannibal arrived at the court of Prusias, king of Bithynia, in northwestern Asia Minor. He served as a military advisor, helping Prusias in his wars against his neighbors. He designed a clever tactic, having clay pots filled with poisonous snakes thrown onto enemy ships, causing panic and confusion. But Rome learned of his presence. The Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus visited Bithynia and demanded that Prusias hand over Hannibal. Prusias, unwilling to antagonize Rome, agreed. Roman soldiers surrounded the house where Hannibal was staying, a modest villa with a garden and several exits, built for exactly this eventuality. Hannibal, realizing that escape was impossible, asked for a moment alone. He took poison, a vial he had carried with him for years, knowing that this day might come. His last words, according to the Roman historian Livy, were a bitter commentary on Roman paranoia. Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man to die. He was 64 years old. He had spent his entire life fighting Rome, and Rome had hounded him to the end. His body was buried in Bithynia, far from Carthage, far from the battlefields of Italy, where he had won his greatest victories. He died in exile, a king without a kingdom, a general without an army, the greatest enemy Rome ever faced. The stubborn phoenix, Carthage's recovery and Cato's obsession. In the decades after the Second Punic War, Carthage surprised everyone by recovering. Despite the loss of its empire, despite the crushing indemnity, despite the ban on military activity without Roman permission, the city began to prosper again. The agricultural lands of the North African interior, the Cura, proved to be extraordinarily productive. Carthaginian farmers, using techniques passed down through generations and refined through Hannibal's reforms, produced bumper crops of grain, olives, and grapes. They developed sophisticated irrigation systems, bringing water from the interior highlands to the coastal plains. They practiced crop rotation, using legumes to restore nitrogen to the soil. They wrote treatises on agriculture, manuals that detailed everything from the breeding of livestock to the proper time for pruning vines. These agricultural writings were so respected that when Carthage was finally destroyed, the Roman Senate ordered them translated into Latin, the only Carthaginian texts deemed worthy of preservation. The city itself was rebuilt and beautified. The walls, damaged during the mercenary war, were repaired and strengthened. New temples were constructed. The harbors, those extraordinary circular basins, continued to serve as commercial ports, though now the ships were merchantmen rather than warships. The population grew. Carthaginian merchants, though restricted by treaty from military adventures, resumed their trading activities across the Mediterranean. They exported grain to Rome, to Greece, to Egypt. They imported manufactured goods, wine, luxury items. Money flowed into the city. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Carthage was once again a wealthy city, its streets bustling, its markets full, its treasury accumulating reserves. The city had been defeated, humiliated, stripped of its empire, but it had not been destroyed. Like a phoenix, it was rising from the ashes, quieter, more humble perhaps, but still prosperous, still significant. This recovery did not go unnoticed in Rome. Many Romans, especially those who had fought in the Punic Wars, viewed Carthage's resurgence with alarm. Foremost among these was Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder, a senator, a veteran of the Second Punic War, and one of the most influential political figures in Rome. Cato had served as a young military tribune in Sicily and had seen firsthand the devastation Hannibal had inflicted on Italy. He had spent his youth hearing stories of Roman defeats, of the terror that had gripped the city when news came of Trebia, of Trasimene, of Cannae. He had lost friends and family members in those battles, and he had absorbed a lesson that shaped his entire political career. Carthage was Rome's eternal enemy, and as long as Carthage existed, Rome could never be truly safe. In his later years, Cato became obsessed with the idea that Carthage, despite the treaty, remained a mortal threat. He traveled to North Africa as part of a senatorial delegation to arbitrate a dispute between Carthage and Numidia, Rome's client kingdom in North Africa. What he saw alarmed him. Carthage was wealthy, its granaries full, its population large and industrious. The city had no army to speak of, as the treaty forbade military preparations, but it had resources, lots of them. Cato returned to Rome and began a campaign to convince the Senate that Carthage must be destroyed utterly, that half measures were insufficient, that the only way to ensure Rome's safety was to erase the city from the face of the earth. He famously ended every speech in the Senate, regardless of the topic being discussed, with the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. He would be discussing tax policy, and finish with furthermore, I think that Carthage must be destroyed. He would be talking about road repairs, and conclude furthermore, I think that Carthage must be destroyed. It became a mantra, a slogan, an obsession, and gradually he convinced others. Not everyone agreed with Cato. Scipio Nasica, a prominent senator, argued that Carthage posed no threat, that destroying a peaceful, unarmed city would be unjust, and that having a potential rival actually made Rome stronger by giving its citizens a reason to remain vigilant and disciplined. But Cato's faction grew. They pointed to Carthage's wealth. They warned that wealth could be converted into military power. They inflamed Roman fears by invoking the memory of Hannibal, by painting vivid pictures of elephants crossing the Alps, by reminding the people that Carthage had once brought Rome to the brink of annihilation. The propaganda worked. Public opinion shifted. The Senate began to look for a pretext for war. That pretext arrived in the form of a border dispute. Carthage's neighbor to the west was the Numidian kingdom of Massinissa, an old man now but in his youth an ally of Scipio Africanus and a cavalry commander of genius. Massinissa had been rewarded for his loyalty to Rome with a kingdom carved out of Carthaginian territory. For decades he had spent his time encroaching on what remained of Carthage's territory, seizing border towns, annexing farmland, knowing that Carthage could not retaliate without Roman permission. The Carthaginians appealed to Rome repeatedly, sending embassies to complain, to present evidence, to ask for arbitration. Rome invariably sided with Massinissa. The situation became intolerable. Finally, in 150 BCE, Carthage, in frustration and desperation, raised an army and attacked Massinissa. The attack was a military failure. Massinissa, despite his advanced age, was still a brilliant commander, and his Numidian cavalry defeated the poorly trained Carthaginian levies. But from Rome's perspective, Carthage had violated the treaty. The city had waged war without permission. Rome declared war. Delenda est, the siege and destruction of Carthage. When Rome declared the Third Punic War in 149 BCE, the Carthaginians were initially hopeful that they could avoid disaster by submitting completely. Rome demanded hostages, and Carthage sent 300 sons of noble families to Roman custody, guaranteeing good behavior. Rome demanded that all weapons and armor be surrendered, and Carthage complied, delivering to the Roman camp vast quantities of arms, 200,000 sets of armor, 2,000 catapults, an arsenal sufficient to equip a major army. The Carthaginians had disarmed themselves completely, trusting in Rome's mercy. Then Rome revealed the true demand. A senatorial delegation arrived and announced that Carthage must be abandoned entirely. The entire population must move at least 10 miles inland, away from the sea. The city itself must be destroyed, demolished, erased. Carthage could exist as a people, but not as a city, not as a maritime power. The Carthaginians, when they heard this, understood immediately what it meant. To abandon the city and the sea was to abandon everything that made them Carthaginians. It was to accept cultural annihilation, to become a people without identity, without purpose. It was unacceptable. The Carthaginian Senate met in emergency session. The debate was agonized. Some argued for submission, pointing out that resistance was hopeless. Carthage had no army, no weapons, no allies. The city could not possibly withstand a Roman siege. Better to accept exile, to survive as a people even if the city was lost. Others argued for defiance. If Rome intended to destroy Carthage, then Carthage had nothing to lose by fighting. Better to die with honor, defending the city, than to slink away into the interior and live as displaced refugees. The faction favoring resistance prevailed. Carthage declared that it would not abandon the city. The gates were closed, the walls manned, and every citizen, man, woman, and child, was mobilized for defense. They tore down temples and public buildings to use the timber for catapults and war machines. Women cut off their hair to braid into bowstrings. Slaves were freed and armed. Foundries worked day and night, melting down metal ornaments and statues to forge new weapons. In a matter of weeks, Carthage had re-equipped an army out of nothing. It was a desperate, hopeless act of defiance, but it was also magnificent. The city would not go quietly. The Roman army, commanded by the consul Manius Manilius, established a camp outside the city and began the siege. But the siege did not go as planned. Carthage's walls were immensely strong, 40 feet high and 30 feet thick in places, constructed of massive stone blocks. The circuit of the walls was some 22 miles, enclosing not just the city but gardens and orchards, enough agricultural land to feed the population during a siege. The Romans attempted to storm the walls and were repulsed with heavy losses. They tried to blockade the city, but Carthaginian ships built in secret within the circular harbors broke the blockade at night, bringing in supplies from the coast. The defenders fought with the desperation of the doomed, sallying out at night to burn Roman siege equipment, rebuilding breaches in the walls faster than the Romans could create them, fighting from the rooftops, hurling stones and boiling oil down on attackers. The siege dragged on for months, then for a year, then for 2 years. The Romans made little progress. The situation was becoming an embarrassment. Rome, which had defeated Macedon and Greece, which was now the dominant power in the Mediterranean, could not take a single city defended by untrained civilians. The Roman Senate, frustrated and angry, appointed a new commander. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated Hannibal. Scipio Aemilianus was a hard, disciplined officer, a man who understood siege warfare. He arrived in 147 BCE and immediately took control. He tightened the siege, cutting off all supplies to the city by land and by sea. He built a massive mole across the entrance to the harbor, a stone causeway 200 feet wide, sealing the harbor completely. The Carthaginians, in response, performed an extraordinary feat of engineering. They dug a new channel to the sea from the inner circular harbor, working in secret, laboring day and night. When the channel was complete, they launched a fleet of 50 ships, built in secrecy within the covered ship sheds, using timber scavenged from buildings. The fleet sailed out, taking the Romans completely by surprise. But the Carthaginians, jubilant at their success, failed to press their advantage. Instead of attacking immediately, they sailed around in formation, demonstrating their achievement. The Romans had time to recover, to man their own ships, to prepare for battle. When the Carthaginians finally attacked, the battle was fierce but indecisive. The Carthaginian fleet retreated into the harbor, and Scipio tightened the blockade further. It would be the last act of the Carthaginian navy, that institution which had once ruled the western seas. Now the city was truly alone. Inside the walls, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food supplies dwindled. Starvation set in. Disease spread through the crowded, unsanitary streets. The population began to die, not from Roman weapons, but from hunger and sickness. People ate anything they could find: leather, boiled seaweed, rats, even, in whispered horror, each other. Children died in their mothers' arms. The elderly collapsed in the streets. But still, the city did not surrender. The defenders manned the walls, skeletal figures in rags, keeping watch, because to surrender was to accept annihilation anyway. At least this way, they could die as Carthaginians. In the spring of 146 BCE, Scipio judged that the moment had come. He launched the final assault. Roman legionaries stormed the walls with scaling ladders, fighting their way onto the ramparts. The defenders, weakened by starvation, could not repel them. The Romans poured into the city through multiple breaches, but even now the Carthaginians did not give up. The fighting moved into the streets, from house to house, from room to room. It was brutal, close-quarters combat. The Carthaginians, armed with whatever weapons they could find, contested every alley, every building. Families barricaded themselves in their homes and fought to the death. The Roman advance was measured in yards, in hours, in blood. The legionaries had to fight their way up the narrow streets toward the Bursa, the citadel. Many of the streets were too narrow for formations, forcing the Romans to fight as individuals. The Carthaginians rained missiles down from the rooftops, hurled bricks and tiles, poured boiling liquids, set fires. Entire blocks burned. The smoke was so thick that soldiers could barely see. The wounded and the dead lay in piles, trampled by the advancing troops. For 6 days and 6 nights, the battle raged through Carthage, a final terrible convulsion. On the 7th day, the surviving Carthaginians, perhaps 50,000 people, most of them emaciated and barely able to walk, crowded into the Bursa. They barricaded themselves in the temple of Eshmun, the great temple that had stood for centuries at the summit of the hill. Scipio sent heralds offering terms, surrender, and they would be sold into slavery, but their lives would be spared. Most accepted, shuffling out of the temple, a ragged procession of starving, defeated people, the last remnants of a civilization that had once ruled the seas. But a few hundred refused, led by Hasdrubal, the Carthaginian commander who had led the defense, and by his wife. They chose death over surrender. According to the historian Appian, Hasdrubal himself came out at the last moment and groveled before Scipio, begging for mercy. But his wife, seeing his cowardice, refused to leave. She stood on the temple steps, her children beside her, and denounced her husband. Then she killed her children and threw herself into the flames as the temple burned around her. It was the final act of Carthaginian defiance, a woman and her children choosing death rather than Roman slavery. Scipio Aemilianus, standing on the Borsa, watching the city burn below him, was said to have wept. When his companion, the historian Polybius, asked why he wept on the day of his greatest triumph, Scipio replied that he was thinking of the fate of empires, that all great powers, even Rome itself, would one day fall. Then he quoted Homer. "The day shall come in which our sacred Troy, and Priam, and the people over whom spear-bearing Priam rules, shall perish all." It was a moment of rare introspection, a recognition that empires rise and fall, that nothing is permanent. Then Scipio ordered his men to complete the destruction. The demolition of Carthage was systematic and thorough. The city was not simply sacked and abandoned. It was erased. Every building was pulled down, stone by stone. The rubble was gathered and burned. The foundations were dug up. According to legend, the Romans plowed the ground with salt, a ritual curse to ensure that nothing would ever grow there again, that the land would be barren forever. Modern historians doubt the literal truth of the salting. Salt was expensive, and plowing an entire city with it would have been prohibitively costly. But the symbolic truth remains. Carthage was to be utterly destroyed, not just as a city but as an idea. The Roman Senate passed a decree forbidding anyone from living on the site. The territory of Carthage became Roman land, ager publicus, and was eventually distributed to Roman colonists. The surviving Carthaginians, those 50,000 who had surrendered, were sold into slavery, scattered across the Mediterranean, their language and culture dying with them. The libraries of Carthage, containing centuries of accumulated knowledge, navigation, agriculture, history, literature, were burned or shipped to Rome, where they vanished. Only the agricultural treatises survived, translated into Latin. Everything else was lost. Carthago Delenda estimated, Carthage must be destroyed. And it was. Ghosts and echoes. The legacy of Carthage. For more than a century after its destruction, the site where Carthage had stood remained desolate. It was said to be cursed, haunted by the ghosts of the slaughtered population. No one would live there. The ruins, overgrown with weeds and scraped by wind, slowly crumbled into the earth. Then, in 29 BCE, the Roman Emperor Augustus, seeking to ease overcrowding in Rome and to reward his veterans with land, decided to found a new city on the ruins. It was called Colonia Julia Carthago, and it was designed from the beginning as a Roman city. The new Carthage thrived. Its position was still strategic, commanding the narrow strait between Africa and Sicily. The surrounding land was still fertile, capable of producing vast quantities of grain. Within a few decades, the new city had a population of hundreds of thousands. It became the capital of the Roman province of Africa, one of the wealthiest and most important cities in the Roman Empire. But it was a Roman city, not a Punic one. Latin was spoken in its streets, not Phoenician. Roman gods were worshipped in its temples. Roman law governed its courts. The Carthage of Hannibal and Hamilcar, of the purple dye and the circular harbors, was gone as thoroughly as if it had never existed. For centuries after, the only memory of Punic Carthage came from the writings of its enemies. The Greeks and Romans wrote the history, and in their telling, the Carthaginians were the villains. They were described as treacherous, breaking treaties without scruple. They were called cruel, sacrificing children to their gods. They were labeled as decadent, wallowing in luxury while their mercenaries fought their wars. They were portrayed as cowards, buying their safety with gold rather than defending it with swords. Everything that Rome despised was projected onto Carthage. Hannibal, the greatest general of the age, was remembered primarily as a monster, the bogeyman who had brought terror to Italy, the enemy whose name Roman mothers invoked to frighten naughty children. Hannibal, ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates, became a proverbial expression for impending disaster. The rest of Carthaginian civilization, its merchants and sailors, its farmers and craftsmen, its achievements in navigation and agriculture, was forgotten or dismissed as unworthy of memory. This narrative persisted for nearly 2,000 years. Medieval and Renaissance scholars, reading the classical sources uncritically, accepted the Roman portrayal. Carthage was the evil empire that Rome had righteously destroyed. Hannibal was the barbarian invader who had threatened civilization. It was not until the 19th century, with the development of modern archaeology and critical historical method, that scholars began to question this narrative and to seek a more balanced understanding. French archaeologists working in Tunisia, which was then a French protectorate, began to excavate the site of ancient Carthage. They uncovered the foundations of houses and temples, revealing a city of considerable architectural sophistication. They found the Tophet, with its thousands of urns and stelae, forcing a confrontation with the disturbing question of child sacrifice. They excavated the harbors, revealing the extraordinary engineering that had made Carthage a naval superpower. They found pottery, coins, jewelry, everyday objects that spoke of a vibrant cosmopolitan city. Slowly, a picture emerged of a civilization far more complex and interesting than the Roman caricature. Modern scholarship has been more generous to Carthage. We now recognize that the city was not merely a den of merchants and mercenaries, but a sophisticated urban center, one of the great cities of the ancient world. We know that Carthaginian agriculture was advanced, that its techniques were respected even by the Romans. We know that Carthage was a center of trade and commerce, a place where people and goods from across the Mediterranean met and mingled. We know that it had a republican government, oligarchic and exclusive but stable, that lasted for centuries. We know that it produced generals of genius, men like Hamilcar and Hannibal, who commanded armies with skill and won victories against overwhelming odds. And we know that the accusations of systematic child sacrifice, while they cannot be entirely dismissed, are far more ambiguous than the Roman sources suggest. Were some children sacrificed in times of extreme crisis? Perhaps. Were infants who died of natural causes given special burial in the Tophet? Probably. The truth is complex, and the archaeological evidence supports multiple interpretations. What is clear is that the Carthaginians were a people, not monsters. They had their virtues and their vices, their moments of glory and their failures. They were, in short, human. The physical legacy of Carthage is fragmentary. At the site near modern Tunis, little remains of the Punic city. The Roman city was built over it, and then the Vandals, the Byzantines, and the Arabs built over the Roman city. What survives is a palimpsest, layers of occupation, with the Punic layer at the bottom, fragmentary, and difficult to interpret. A few walls, a few columns, the outline of the harbors, now partially filled in and silted over. The great temple of Eshmun is gone, replaced first by a Roman forum and now by a French colonial cathedral. The Byrsa is a hill with archaeological trenches and the foundations of Roman buildings. The ship sheds, those extraordinary covered slips that once housed 200 warships, are buried under soil and later construction. Only fragments survive, hints of a vanished world. But the legacy of Carthage is larger than stones and sherds. It lies in the story, in the audacity of a people who fled from Tyre and founded a city on a hostile shore, who built that city into an empire, who challenged Rome and nearly won. It lies in the genius of Hannibal, who crossed the Alps with elephants and taught Rome the meaning of fear. It lies in the tragic grandeur of the city's end, the 3-year siege, the final burning, the refusal to surrender. And it lies in the reminder that history is written by the victors, and that we must look beyond the official narratives to find the truth. In the lands that were once the Carthaginian Empire, faint traces remain. In Tunisia, the heartland, farmers still plow fields that once fed the city. Sometimes they turn up fragments of pottery, coins worn smooth by time, bits of bronze and glass. In the souk of Tunisia, merchants haggle over prices in Arabic, but the rhythm of commerce, the negotiation and bargaining, echoes the markets of ancient Carthage. Across the Mediterranean, in Spain and Sicily, in Sardinia and Malta, place names preserve Punic roots. Malta's language, Malti, is a Semitic tongue descended from Arabic, but containing echoes of the Phoenician that was once spoken across the region. The word Punic itself survives in the phrase Punic faith fides punica, in Latin, meaning treacherous or unreliable, a lasting slander that the Romans inflicted on their defeated enemy. But there are other legacies, less tangible but no less real. The Carthaginians were pioneers of maritime trade, of long-distance navigation, of commercial networks that bound together distant lands. They sailed beyond the known world to Britain for tin, down the coast of Africa, into unknown waters. They understood that commerce was more than the exchange of goods. It was the exchange of ideas, of technologies, of cultures. In this they were ancestors of the globalized world we inhabit today. And they remind us that empires rise and fall, that power is fleeting, that even the mightiest civilization can be destroyed utterly, leaving only fragments and memories behind. Fading voices, the end of our journey. And so our voyage through the ruins of Carthage comes to an end. We have walked the streets of a city that no longer exists, sailed on seas now ruled by different powers, and witnessed the rise and fall of an empire that defied Rome. We have stood in the bustling markets of the Punic capital, smelled the stench of the dye works, heard the clash of oars in the circular harbors. We have followed the merchant ships on their perilous voyages, felt the cold spray of the Atlantic on Hanno's expedition, and shared the terror and exhaustion of Hannibal's army crossing the Alps in winter. We have stood on the field of Cannae, that masterpiece of tactical genius where 50,000 men died in an afternoon. We have witnessed the slow grinding down of Hannibal's campaign in Italy, the turn of the tide in Spain, the final confrontation at Zama. And we have endured the 3-year siege, the street-by-street fighting, the flames that consumed 7 centuries of civilization. The stones are silent, now. The harbors are empty, their waters still. The voices that once filled the streets with a babble of languages, Punic and Greek, Berber and Iberian, are long stilled. The ships that once commanded the western seas are rotted away, their bronze rams buried in the mud of forgotten harbors. The elephants that crossed the Alps are dust. The soldiers who fought at Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae are bones in Italian soil. The women who cut their hair for bowstrings, the children who died in the final siege, the merchant princes who built their fortunes on purple dye and Spanish silver, all are gone, forgotten, their names lost, their stories reduced to fragments in the hostile testimony of their enemies. Carthage was destroyed so thoroughly that for centuries it existed only as a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens to those who challenge Rome. But the story that emerges from the fragments and the archaeology, from the coins and the pottery and the foundations of buildings, is more complex and more human than the Roman propaganda allows. Carthage was a city built on commerce, on the movement of goods and people across the Mediterranean. It was founded by refugees fleeing tyranny, by people who had lost everything and who built a new home in a hostile land through ingenuity and determination. It grew to become the wealthiest city in the Western world, a place where cultures mingled, where Greek met Berber met Iberian in the marketplace, where ideas and technologies flowed along trade routes that stretched from Britain to the coast of Africa. It was ruled by an oligarchy of merchant families, a system that was neither democratic nor tyrannical but that provided stability for centuries. It built an empire not through conquest alone, but through trade and treaty, through a pragmatic recognition that profit was more sustainable than glory. And when it went to war, it did so with hired soldiers from a dozen nations, commanded by generals of genius who won victories that echo through the millennia. But Carthage's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. The city was built on the sea, and when it lost control of the sea, when Rome built a navy and contested Carthaginian supremacy, the entire system began to unravel. The First Punic War was long and costly, ending in Carthaginian defeat and humiliation. The Second Punic War, Hannibal's War, was Rome's closest brush with annihilation, a conflict that might have ended Roman power had Hannibal received the support he needed from Carthage. But the oligarchs in Carthage, cautious and divided, did not fully support him, and Rome, grimly determined and willing to absorb staggering casualties, ground him down through attrition. The Third Punic War was not really a war at all, but an execution, a deliberate act of annihilation driven by fear and revenge. Rome destroyed Carthage not because the city threatened Rome, but because Rome could not tolerate even the possibility of a rival, could not bear to live in a world where Carthage existed. The destruction of Carthage was one of the great atrocities of the ancient world, a genocide before the word existed, an act of cultural annihilation that erased 700 years of civilization. But empires that destroy their rivals utterly do not escape consequences. Rome, in destroying Carthage, lost something as well. It lost a rival that had kept it vigilant, that had forced it to innovate, to adapt, to strive. The victory at Carthage marked the moment when Rome ceased to be a republic of citizen soldiers fighting for survival and became an empire of conquest, drunk on power, corrupted by wealth, ruled by generals and demagogues rather than by the Senate. Scipio Aemilianus, weeping as Carthage burned, understood this. He saw in Carthage's fall the foreshadowing of Rome's own eventual collapse. He was right. Rome would endure for another 6 centuries in the west, another 1,000 years in the east as Byzantium, but it would never again be what it had been. Carthage, in death, had inflicted a wound on Rome's soul that never fully healed. Today, if you visit the site of ancient Carthage, you will find a sprawling suburb of Tunis, a mixture of modern buildings, archaeological sites and fragments of Roman ruins. The Punic city is mostly invisible, buried deep beneath later construction. But if you close your eyes and listen, you can almost hear the echoes, the cry of gulls over the water, the splash of oars in the circular harbors, The hammering in the workshops, the singing in the streets, the calls of merchants in the marketplace, the smell of purple dye, of salt spray, of burning incense in the temples, the sight of ships with their reddish sails, heading out to sea at dawn, bound for distant ports and unknown shores. The sound of elephants trumpeting as they march up from their pens, heading for the transport ships that will carry them to war. The voices of children playing in the streets, speaking a language that no one remembers. All of this is gone, erased, silent. But in remembering, in telling the story, in refusing to accept the simplistic narrative of villains and heroes that the victors wrote, we bring Carthage back to life, if only for a moment. We give voice to the voiceless, we honor the defeated, and we remind ourselves that history is not just the story of the winners. The lesson of Carthage, if there is one, is the fragility of civilization, the impermanence of power, the terrible cost of total war. Carthage was not perfect. Its government was oligarchic, its economy built on slavery, its army composed of mercenaries, but it was a real place, inhabited by real people who loved and feared and hoped and dreamed as people do in every age. They built a city on mud and salt water, founded on nothing but determination and skill. They created an empire through trade and navigation. They produced generals who rank among the greatest military minds in history, and they were destroyed, utterly, by a rival that could not tolerate their existence. That is the tragedy at the heart of this story. Not just that Carthage fell, all cities fall, all empires end, but that it was destroyed so completely that almost nothing remains. We are left with fragments, with the bitter testimony of enemies, with archaeological enigmas like the tuffet that raise more questions than they answer. We are left with echoes and ghosts and the persistent feeling that something valuable was lost, something that the world was poorer for losing. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into the past. We have traveled far together, across centuries and seas, through battles and sieges, through glory and tragedy. The story of Carthage is not a happy one. There are no easy heroes, no comfortable morals. It is a story of ambition and genius, of courage and cruelty, of the heights humanity can reach and the depths to which it can fall. It is a story of a city that stood against Rome and lost, but that in losing wrote one of the greatest epics of the ancient world. As we close our eyes and prepare for sleep, let us remember that the past is not dead. It is not even past. It lives in us, in the stories we tell, in the lessons we choose to learn or ignore. The ghosts of Carthage still walk, if we have the imagination to see them, and in seeing them, in remembering them, we do a small justice to a people who were denied even the mercy of being remembered by their own voices. And now, as the night deepens and the story fades, let us honor the memory of those long-dead Carthaginians. Let us remember their courage, their skill, their determination to survive against impossible odds. Let us remember the merchant who sailed to Britain for tin, the farmer who developed new techniques of irrigation, the shipwright who built vessels that could weather any storm, the mother who cut her hair for bowstrings, the soldier who held the walls in the final siege, the woman who chose death over surrender. They are all gone now, swallowed by time. But tonight, for this hour we have spent together, they lived again. We walked their streets, sailed their seas, fought their battles. We gave them voice, if only briefly, and perhaps that is the only immortality any of us can hope for, to be remembered, to have our stories told, to live on in the imagination of those who come after. The stars wheel overhead, the same stars that guided Carthaginian navigators across unknown seas. The Mediterranean laps at the shores, where once great fleets were launched. The wind whispers through the ruins, through the few standing columns and weathered stones that mark where once a great city stood. Somewhere in that wind, if you listen carefully, you might hear echoes, the chant of rowers pulling their oars in unison, the cry of an auction in the marketplace, the hymn of priests in the temple of Tanit, the last defiant shout of defenders on the Berber as the flames rose around them. These echoes are faint now, almost inaudible, fading with each passing year. But as long as there are people to listen, as long as there are people to tell the story, Carthage endures, not in stone, but in memory, not in the land, but in the imagination, not as it was portrayed by its enemies, but as it truly was, a great city, a powerful empire, a civilization that burned brightly for 700 years before it was extinguished. Rest now, traveler. Our journey through the past is complete. The gates of Carthage are closed, the harbors are empty, The fires have burned out, only silence remains. And the slow, patient work of wind and rain and time, wearing away even the memory of what once was. Sleep well and dream of purple-sailed ships disappearing over the horizon, of elephants crossing snow-covered mountain passes, of a city that stood against Rome and nearly won. Dream of Carthage, that impossible city, built on water and ambition, destroyed by fear and envy, remembered now only in fragments and in stories like this one. Until we meet again in another chapter of history. Until another night when we travel together into the past, I bid you farewell. The archive closes, the scrolls are returned to their shelves, the voices of the dead fade back into silence. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and know that in remembering we honor, in telling their stories we give the dead a kind of life, and in learning from their triumphs and their tragedies we perhaps become a little wiser. Good night.